My father stood on the freezing tarmac, blocking the door to our private jet. He looked me dead in the eye and said my ticket was canceled to make room for my sister's poodle. He told me to walk back to Chicago. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and sent a 2-word text. You sure? 3 minutes later, security was dragging my family off the plane into the blizzard. But that was just the beginning of how I dismantled their entire fake empire. My name is Savannah, 34 years old, and I am a senior partner at one of the largest private equity firms in Chicago. But to my family, I was just a low-level accountant they could walk all over. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a lesson they will never forget. The wind howled across the private runway in Aspen, Colorado, biting through my wool coat with brutal force. The sky was an unforgiving sheet of gray heavy with an impending blizzard. But the sub-zero temperature was nothing compared to the absolute ice in my father's eyes. Richard, my 62-year-old father, stood at the base of the boarding stairs of a sleek Gulfstream jet. He was dressed in a tailored cashmere overcoat, looking every bit the wealthy chief executive officer of a Chicago supply chain company he pretended to be. I wheeled my suitcase toward the stairs, my boots crunching in the fresh snow, exhausted from a week of silently paying for their lavish ski vacation while they treated me like their personal assistant. As I reached the bottom step, he held up a gloved hand, physically blocking my path. "Stop right there, Savannah," he commanded, his voice slicing through the roaring wind. "Your ticket has been canceled." I stared at him, pulling my collar up against the freezing air. I asked him what on earth he was talking about. We had chartered this flight together. I had explicitly managed the booking. Before Richard could answer, a sharp, frantic tapping on the jet window drew my attention upward. My 29-year-old sister Cassidy peered down at me from inside the warm, luxurious cabin. She was wrapped in an absurd, oversized designer fur coat, clutching her shivering toy poodle to her chest. She forced the window blind up higher and yelled through the thick glass. Her dog was having a severe panic attack, she claimed. She insisted the poodle absolutely needed its own empty seat for anxiety reasons, and I was making the dog's trauma worse by standing out there arguing about boarding. Then my 32-year-old brother-in-law Jamal leaned into view behind her. He was the chief financial officer at Richard's company, a man who loved playing the big shot with corporate money he did not actually earn. Jamal casually adjusted his expensive designer watch, flashing a condescending grin. He shouted down that he had bumped into 2 major VIP investors at the ski lodge bar. He had invited them to fly back to Chicago with us to seal a massive business deal. Between the investors and the dog, the plane was at maximum capacity. "Jamal, you are the chief financial officer," I called back, my voice steady despite the howling wind. "You should know the charter manifest cannot be legally altered 5 minutes before takeoff to accommodate unvetted passengers." Jamal laughed, a sound that carried clearly over the tarmac. "I am the one writing the checks, Savannah. The charter company works for us. Now step back before you get caught in the engine wash." I looked back at Richard, refusing to break eye contact. "So you are kicking your own daughter off a flight in the middle of a winter storm, warning for a dog and 2 strangers?" Richard sneered, his breath pluming in the freezing air like smoke. "You are the healthiest one here, Savannah. Catch a commercial flight or walk back to Chicago. It builds character." The audacity was staggering, yet it was so perfectly aligned with how they had always treated me. For my entire life, my needs, my safety, and my basic dignity were pushed aside to accommodate Cassidy's ridiculous whims and Richard's massive ego. My mother, Patricia, suddenly appeared at the top of the boarding stairs. At 60 years old, she had perfected the art of enabling this toxic behavior and weaponizing maternal guilt against me to protect her favorite child. She looked down at me, shivering in the snow, her face twisted in a mask of manufactured disappointment. "Do not be selfish, Savannah," Patricia called down, pulling her silk scarf tighter around her neck to block the chill. "You have always been so difficult. Why must everything be a battle with you? Cassidy is holding a beautiful new dog. She has anxiety, and you are standing there making her feel guilty. Do you have any idea how hard this trip has been on her? Jamal needs to impress these investors for the survival of the family business. Be the bigger person for once and stop making a scene." You are ruining the end of our vacation. Listen to your mother, Richard added, glaring at me. You are 34 years old single and have no real responsibilities. We are running a multi-million-dollar empire. Our time is valuable. Your time is expendable. The commercial airport is a 2-mile walk. Get moving. I looked at the four of them. The golden child sister, the enabling mother, the arrogant brother-in-law, and the narcissistic father. They looked down at me from their literal and figurative pedestal, fully expecting me to break down. They expected me to cry, to beg for a seat, or to quietly accept the humiliation and drag my luggage through the blizzard to the commercial terminal, paying for my own overpriced flight home. Instead, I felt a profound, dangerous calm settle over me. The biting cold seeped through the soles of my boots, but the fire igniting in my chest kept me perfectly warm. For 34 years, I had swallowed their insults. I had allowed them to treat my career as a joke, my presence as an obligation, and my bank account as their personal safety net. I had quietly covered the cost of this entire Aspen trip through a proxy vendor just to keep Richard's failing company from bouncing checks, all while they treated me like a pack mule. Today the grace period expired. "Close the door," Richard barked to the flight attendant standing nervously inside the cabin. "We have a strict schedule to keep, and I am not freezing out here any longer." He turned his back on me and marched up the stairs. The heavy cabin door whined loudly as its hydraulics engaged, retracting the stairs and slamming shut right in my face. The heavy mechanical locks clicked into place with a definitive thud, sealing them inside their warm bubble of luxury. I stood completely alone on the tarmac. The snow began to fall much heavier now, quickly dusting my dark coat and hair in white. I did not scream at the departing jet. I did not shed a single tear of rejection. I just stood there perfectly calm, watching the massive jet engines begin to whine as they prepared for their pre-flight checks. What my family did not know was that I was not the low-level corporate accountant they loved to mock. I was a ruthless forensic accountant and a senior partner at Apex Holdings. And Apex Holdings had outright purchased the exact aviation charter company that owned the jet they were currently sitting on just last month. I owned the plane. I owned the tarmac access. I practically owned the air they were breathing inside that pressurized cabin. They had just locked the owner out of her own property. I reached into my pocket, my bare fingers brushing against the freezing metal of my phone. I unlocked the screen, ready to make my first move. My screen illuminated through the blinding snow. A group message notification popped up from Richard. I tapped it open. It read, "Taking off. Enjoy the walk. Make sure you use the shoulder of the highway so the plows do not hit you." A second later, a notification from Cassidy appeared. It was a laughing emoji, followed by a photo of her poodle sitting on a plush leather seat, drinking from a crystal water bowl. Jamal chimed in next, sending a picture of a newly popped champagne bottle with the caption "VIPs only." I did not block their numbers. I did not type out a paragraph of anger. I simply stared at the screen as snowflakes landed and melted against the glass. The sheer arrogance of these people was breathtaking. They truly believed they held all the power. They thought money and a fake facade of high society status shielded them from consequences. They forgot that I was the one who actually understood how real money worked. I typed exactly 2 words into the chat. "You sure?" I hit send and immediately closed the messaging app. I did not wait for their replies. Instead, I opened my secure corporate directory and dialed a direct unlisted phone number. It was not the general customer service line for the charter company. It was the emergency operations hotline for Apex Aviation Management. The line rang exactly once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Operations Center, this is Harrison." "Harrison, it is Savannah," I said, my voice perfectly steady in the freezing wind. "I need an immediate hold on a flight departing from Aspen." Miss Savannah, Harrison replied, his tone shifting instantly from standard professional deference to high alert urgency. "Of course, ma'am. Which aircraft?" "Tail number November 72, Echo Alpha," I stated, reading the registration right off the side of the jet sitting 20 yards away from me. "I am a senior partner at Apex Holdings." My firm had executed a hostile takeover of this specific aviation management company exactly 32 days ago. We specialized in acquiring distressed luxury service providers and stripping out the financial rot. One of those pieces of financial rot was my father's company. Jamal liked to call himself a financial genius, but the man rarely read past the first page of a vendor contract. If he had bothered to do his due diligence, he would have seen that the aviation charter company's new parent corporation was Apex Holdings. He would have seen my name listed on the board of directors. But Jamal was too busy ordering custom business cards and playing golf to actually manage Richard's supply chain logistics. For the past 6 months, Richard's supply chain business had been quietly bleeding cash. Jamal, as the brilliant chief financial officer, had been playing a dangerous game of financial shell games, floating invoices and delaying vendor payments to keep up their billionaire lifestyle. They were completely unaware that Apex Holdings had flagged their corporate charter account as severely delinquent. They owed over $200,000 in backlogged flight fees. The only reason this Gulfstream had even been dispatched to Aspen in the first place was because I had quietly placed a temporary administrative hold on their collection status. I had protected them from being grounded before the trip even began. Harrison typed rapidly on his end of the line. I have the flight details pulled up. Gulfstream G650 scheduled for Chicago. They are currently spooling engines and awaiting taxi clearance from the tower. What are your orders? Revoke their clearance immediately, I commanded. On what grounds, ma'am? Delinquent corporate accounts, I replied smoothly. Furthermore, the chief financial officer Jamal has just admitted to making unauthorized last-minute passenger manifest changes by bringing two unvetted individuals on board. That is a direct violation of our security protocols for corporate leases. Ground the aircraft right now. Understood, Harrison said without hesitation. Contacting Aspen Tower and the flight crew right now. I will issue a hard ground order. They will not move an inch. Thank you, Harrison. Oh, and one more thing. Lock the corporate account. No further bookings are authorized under Richard's company name until the outstanding balance of $212,000 is paid in full via certified wire transfer. Consider it done, Miss Savannah. The pilot is receiving the abort order as we speak. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my heavy wool coat. I did not walk away. I stood right there in the snow, my boots planted firmly on the freezing tarmac, and watched the massive machine in front of me. For 30 seconds, the jet engines continued their high-pitched whine, preparing to push the heavy aircraft toward the runway. Inside that cabin, my family was likely sipping their stolen champagne, congratulating themselves on putting the family disappointment in her place. They were probably laughing at my two-word text message, thinking it was a pathetic, empty threat from a powerless woman. Then the beautiful sound of consequence arrived. The deafening roar of the Gulfstream engines suddenly pitched down. The powerful vibration shaking the tarmac began to stutter and fade. The high-pitched whine dropped into a low mechanical groan as the pilot abruptly cut the fuel lines. Within 10 seconds, the massive turbines spun down into complete silence. The flashing red anti-collision beacons on the top and bottom of the fuselage switched off. The aircraft went completely dead on the runway. I smiled watching the dark-tinted windows of the cabin. I could only imagine the sudden jarring silence inside. The pilot would be emerging from the cockpit right about now, looking at Richard and Jamal with an expression of severe professional embarrassment. He would be informing them that air traffic control had just pulled their clearance and management had flagged their corporate account for immediate suspension. The snow was falling heavier now, coating the silent, grounded jet in a layer of white frost. The biting wind whipped around me, but I felt entirely invincible. My family had spent my entire life making me feel small. They had demanded respect without earning it, and expected loyalty while offering nothing but cruelty in return. They believed they could discard me on a freezing runway and simply fly away back to their comfortable lives of delusion and excess. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world operated. In the real world, actions have financial consequences. In the real world, you do not bite the hand that secretly balances your checkbook. And most importantly, in the real world, you never ever test a forensic accountant who has access to your deepest financial secrets. I turned my back on the dead aircraft and began walking. I did not walk toward the distant commercial terminal or the snowy highway as Richard had so callously suggested. I walked directly toward the private terminal where the exclusive owner's lounge was located. The building was glowing with warm amber light through the large glass windows. Inside there was a roaring fireplace premium espresso and a leather armchair waiting just for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, once, twice, then a continuous rapid vibration that signaled absolute sheer panic. The group chat was likely exploding. They were realizing that my text was not a joke. They were realizing they were not flying anywhere. I did not reach for the phone. Let them panic. Let them freeze. Let them sit in the dark silence of a grounded jet and wonder how their perfect plan had just spectacularly collapsed. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the terminal, stepping into the glorious heat of the building. I unbuttoned my coat, ready to watch the next phase of this spectacular implosion unfold. I walked across the plush carpet of the owner lounge, moving toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the runway. The interior was a sanctuary of rich mahogany and heated floors, a stark contrast to the brutal blizzard raging just inches away on the other side of the glass. An attendant silently offered me a freshly pulled espresso in a delicate porcelain cup. I accepted it, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic, and took a slow sip. The bitter dark roast was perfect. From my vantage point, I had a front row seat to the exact parking spot of the Gulfstream. 3 minutes had passed since my phone call. Right on schedule, a pair of airport security vehicles with flashing yellow lights pulled up alongside the grounded aircraft. 2 uniformed officers stepped out into the driving snow. The heavy cabin door of the jet swung open again. This time it was not my father shutting me out. It was the captain gesturing firmly toward the stairs. Through the thick glass of the lounge window, I watched the pantomime of absolute humiliation unfold. Jamal was the first to emerge. He stumbled down the steps, clutching his designer briefcase, his earlier swagger entirely erased. He kept looking back over his shoulder, trying to save face in front of the 2 VIP investors who followed closely behind him. The investors looked furious, pulling their coats tight and immediately walking away from Jamal toward a waiting shuttle. Jamal stood on the tarmac, waving his hands in a desperate attempt to explain, but they did not even look back. Then came my mother and sister. Cassidy was struggling to walk in her high-heeled winter boots, shivering violently as the wind whipped her oversized fur coat around her. She was clutching her poodle, appearing utterly, completely lost. Patricia trailed behind her, holding onto the handrail for dear life, looking around the desolate tarmac, as if waiting for a manager to complain to. Finally, Richard appeared. His face was a mask of pure rage. I could see him shouting at the security officers, pointing his finger aggressively toward the terminal and then back at the plane. The officers remained entirely unmoved, simply pointing toward the exit gate. My father, the man who loved to project absolute authority, was being treated like a common trespasser. My phone began to vibrate against the marble countertop where I had placed it. The screen lit up with Richard calling. I let it ring. I took another sip of my espresso, watching the dark liquid swirl in the cup. The phone stopped, then immediately started vibrating again. This time it was Patricia, then Jamal, then Cassidy. A frantic symphony of buzzing plastic and glass mirroring the absolute chaos unfolding out in the cold. They were standing in a blizzard, stripped of their transportation, stripped of their fake prestige, and stripped of the one person they usually relied on to fix their messes. I watched them huddled together near the security vehicles, waiting for a shuttle that would take them to the commercial terminal. The wind was relentless, driving the snow sideways. They looked small. They looked weak. They looked exactly how they had made me feel for my entire life. Seeing them shivering in the snow brought a very specific memory rushing back to the surface. It was a cold day, much like this one 12 years ago in Chicago. It was the day of my college graduation. I had spent 4 grueling years working double shifts to pay my own tuition because Richard refused to fund a degree in accounting. He called it a glorified bookkeeping certificate. Despite the exhaustion and the financial stress, I had graduated at the top of my class. I had reserved 4 front-row seats for my family. I sat in the auditorium wearing my cap and gown, staring at those 4 empty chairs as the ceremony began. I kept checking the entrance, hoping they were just stuck in traffic. When my name was called to walk across the stage and receive my honors diploma, I looked out into the crowd of cheering families. My row was completely empty. I smiled for the camera, took my degree, and walked off the stage in total silence. It was not until 2 hours later, as I stood alone in the campus courtyard, holding my diploma, that my phone finally buzzed. It was a text message from Patricia. It read, "Cassidy woke up with a minor cold and a slight fever. We had to take her to the clinic just to be safe. We are taking her out for ice cream now to make her feel better. Sorry we missed the ceremony. We will celebrate your little degree some other time." A minor cold. My sister had the sniffles, and my entire family abandoned my college graduation to buy her ice cream. When I finally arrived back at our house that evening, I found them all sitting in the living room laughing and watching a movie. Cassidy was perfectly fine eating a massive hot fudge sundae. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper when I walked in. He simply asked if I was ready to start paying rent now that my little school project was over. I had stood in the doorway, clutching my honors diploma, feeling entirely invisible. They had reduced my years of struggle and my greatest achievement to a mere inconvenience. They had sent a clear, undeniable message that my milestones would never matter as much as Cassidy and her minor discomforts. I looked down at my phone, which was now displaying 27 missed calls and 15 new text messages. The screen was a chaotic mess of demands, apologies, and threats. I leaned closer to the lounge window, resting my hand against the cool glass. Out on the tarmac, the airport shuttle had finally arrived. My family piled into the back of the crowded bus, surrounded by strangers forced to carry their own heavy luxury luggage because the VIP service had been explicitly revoked. Jamal was arguing with the shuttle driver. Richard was aggressively typing on his phone, probably trying to reach my number for the 30th time. Patricia was wrapping her scarf around Cassidy, who looked like she was throwing a full-blown temper tantrum in the back seat. I finished my espresso and set the empty cup down on the table. The warmth of the lounge enveloped, soothing the last lingering chill from the tarmac. For 12 years, I had carried the heavy burden of their neglect. I had internalized their indifference and convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just became more successful, they would eventually see my worth. But watching them get driven away in that cramped shuttle, I realized the truth. They would never see my worth because their eyes were completely blinded by their own narcissism. They did not abandon me at my graduation because of a cold. They abandoned me because my success threatened their carefully constructed narrative where Cassidy was the star and I was the supporting cast. Today I rewrote the script. I was no longer the invisible daughter waiting for an empty seat. I was the one who owned the entire theater. And the show was just getting started. I watched the airport shuttle lurch forward before the brakes slammed hard. Through the swirling snow, I saw Richard pounding his fist against the shuttle window, pointing directly at the glowing glass wall of the lounge. He had spotted my silhouette. The doors hissed open, and my family poured back out into the blizzard, marching with furious determination toward the private terminal entrance. 30 seconds later, the heavy double doors burst open. A blast of freezing air swept into the quiet mahogany room, followed immediately by my father. His coat was dusted with snow, and his face was twisted in a mask of absolute rage. Behind him, Cassidy clutched her shivering dog, looking completely unhinged, while Patricia rushed in, rubbing her arms to stay warm. Jamal brought up the rear, looking embarrassed and livid. The lounge attendant stepped forward to intercept them, but I raised my hand, signaling security to stand down. "Let them speak." "Savannah, what is the meaning of this?" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He marched right up to my leather armchair, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are throwing a temper tantrum because we asked you to take a later flight. Do you have any idea what you have just done? I will call your accounting firm first thing Monday morning. I will personally speak to your managing director and make sure you are fired for causing a public disturbance and harassing a corporate client. I will ruin your miserable little career." Patricia rushed to his side, wiping fake tears from her eyes. She pointed at Jamal, who was nervously brushing snow off his designer suit. "You humiliated Jamal in front of his biggest investors." Savannah, Patricia cried, her voice pitched high with manufactured devastation. "Those men were ready to sign a multi-million-dollar deal to save the family business, and you made Jamal look like a complete fool. How could you be so spiteful? You have always been jealous of your sister, and now you are trying to destroy her husband's career out of pure malice." Cassidy stomped her boots on the Persian rug. My dog is traumatized, she whined, holding the poodle up as if presenting evidence in court. You are a psychopath, Savannah, who grounds an entire private jet just to get back at their own family. I remained seated. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my espresso cup and took another sip, letting the hot liquid warm my throat. Their screaming felt like white noise, a predictable soundtrack to a movie I had memorized. When they paused to catch their breath, expecting me to apologize, I placed my cup gently on the saucer. I reached into my tote bag resting on the floor beside me. I pulled out a manila folder and dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. You want to ruin my miserable little career, Richard? I asked, keeping my tone dangerously even. Go ahead. Call my managing director. You will find the number right there on the first page of that aviation lease agreement. But you might be surprised who picks up the phone. Richard scowled, snatching the folder off the table. He ripped it open and began scanning the first page. His eyes darted across the legal text. I watched his expression shift from blind rage to confusion, and then to a sudden sickening realization. The color drained from his face as he read the corporate letterhead. Apex Holdings, Richard whispered, staring at the document. This charter company is owned by Apex Holdings. That is right, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. And if you flip to the second page, you will see the board of directors. I am not a low-level accountant, Richard. I am a senior partner at Apex Holdings. My firm bought this aviation company outright exactly 32 days ago. I own the jet you tried to kick me off of. I own the tarmac you were freezing on. I control the corporate account you have been using to fly around the country like a billionaire while your actual business is secretly bleeding cash. The silence in the lounge was absolute. The only sound was the howling wind rattling the heavy glass windows. Patricia stopped crying, her mouth hanging open. Cassidy lowered her dog, looking back and forth between me and Richard as if waiting for a punchline that was never going to arrive. Jamal took a step backward, his eyes wide with terror. He understood what the name Apex Holdings meant. He knew the ruthless reputation of my private equity firm. We were corporate liquidators. And more importantly, he knew what it meant for me to be a forensic auditor at the top of that financial food chain. I stood up slowly, towering over the coffee table. I locked my eyes on Jamal, holding his gaze until I saw him physically tremble. You talk a lot about ruining careers, Richard, I said, never breaking eye contact with my brother-in-law. But you should really worry about your chief financial officer position, Jamal. Because playing fast and loose with invoices is one thing. Committing outright wire fraud is another. Jamal swallowed hard, taking another step back. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, his voice cracking. I smiled a cold smile. The $50,000 you discreetly wired from Richard's corporate contingency fund yesterday afternoon, I stated, measuring every syllable for maximum impact. You thought you could bury it in a dummy vendor account. You thought you could use company money to buy Cassidy that custom Birkin bag she is currently holding. But you forgot one crucial detail, Jamal. You did not bypass my firm's audit flags. Jamal's face turned completely ashen. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the back of a leather chair to steady himself. He looked at Richard, whose eyes were now burning holes into Jamal's skull. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy family had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I turned my back on the stunning display of mutual destruction and walked out of the VIP lounge. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Richard screaming at his precious chief financial officer. The storm outside was finally breaking. The snow had slowed to a light dusting, and the runway plows were clearing the tarmac. I approached the boarding stairs of my Gulfstream jet. The captain stood at the top, looking incredibly nervous. He immediately began apologizing for the earlier confusion, but I raised a hand to stop him. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. He was simply following orders. I stepped into the sprawling cabin, taking in the immaculate cream leather seats, the polished walnut tables, and the absolute glorious silence. I took my seat near the front, buckling in, as the flight attendant offered me a glass of sparkling water. Within 10 minutes, the jet engines roared back to life. I looked out the window as we taxied down the runway. In the distance, I could see my family dragging their heavy designer luggage across the icy parking lot toward the budget rental car counter. There were no luxury black cars waiting for them. Because of the storm and the holiday weekend, the only vehicle available was a dented standard minivan. As the Gulfstream lifted off the runway, soaring smoothly into the winter sky, my phone began to light up. The Wi-Fi on the jet was impeccable, ensuring I did not miss a single moment of my sister's inevitable public meltdown. Cassidy had immediately taken to social media. A notification popped up alerting me that she had gone live on her primary account. I tapped the screen and watched the absolute theater unfold. Cassidy was sitting in the cramped back row of a rented minivan. The lighting was terrible and the loud rattling of the vehicle heater drowned out half of her words. She had smeared her mascara perfectly to look like a distressed victim. She stared into the camera, weeping uncontrollably, telling her thousands of followers that her psychotic, jealous sister had just stranded her in a terrifying blizzard. But Cassidy could never just play the regular victim. She had to escalate the drama. She placed a hand over her flat stomach and sobbed into the lens, claiming that she was in the early stages of a high-risk pregnancy and that the freezing temperatures were putting her unborn child in danger. It was a complete fabrication. Cassidy was not pregnant. She had openly complained at the ski lodge just yesterday about how much she despised children and how they ruined a woman's figure. But the lie worked perfectly for her audience. The comments section of her live stream was a waterfall of sympathy and outrage. People who did not know me were calling me a monster. Then the extended family joined the assault. My phone buzzed relentlessly with incoming messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had watched Cassidy's performance. My Aunt Brenda texted me calling me a heartless disgrace to the family name. Cousin Greg left a voice message demanding I pay for their commercial flights and apologizing immediately. They accused me of having a mental breakdown. They said my career had made me cold and unlovable. They weaponized every insecurity I used to have, bombarding me with hate, to force me back into my designated role as the family punching bag. 5 years ago, reading those messages would have broken me. I would have drafted a dozen frantic apologies trying to explain my side of the story. I would have begged for their understanding. Today I felt absolutely nothing. I did not type a single response. I did not block their numbers either. I simply muted the notifications and placed the phone face down on the polished walnut table next to my sparkling water. Their manufactured outrage meant nothing in the face of federal financial crimes. I opened my encrypted laptop and logged into the secure Apex Holdings server. The smear campaign happening on social media was a pathetic distraction. I had much larger targets to dismantle. I pulled up the unredacted corporate ledgers for Richard's supply chain company. As a senior partner, holding the primary debt collection portfolio, I had unrestricted backdoor access to their financial data. I started with the $50,000 wire transfer Jamal had executed the previous afternoon. It was absurdly easy to track. He had routed the money through a shell vendor listed as a logistics consulting firm, then immediately bounced it to a luxury retail account. It was sloppy, reckless behavior from a man who believed he was untouchable. But as my fingers flew across the keyboard running forensic algorithms on the surrounding data points, I realized the handbag was barely a rounding error. I pulled up the quarterly expense reports and cross-referenced them with the official bank statements. The numbers did not match, not even close. I dug deeper, bypassing their standard accounting software and accessing the raw transactional metadata. A massive, sophisticated web of financial deception began to unfurl across my screen. This was not just Jamal skimming off the top to keep Cassidy dressed in designer labels. This was an organized, systemic double-ledger operation. Richard's entire company was built on a foundation of sand. They were hiding millions of dollars in toxic debt while reporting record profits to their shareholders and creditors. I mapped out the offshore routing numbers tracking the money as it bled out of the company and flowed directly into personal accounts controlled by Richard and Jamal. They were bleeding the company dry to fund their private club memberships, their luxury vehicles, and their sprawling real estate properties. And the most beautiful part of this entire discovery was the timing. I knew exactly why they were suddenly so desperate to maintain their facade of incredible wealth. Richard was currently in the final stages of negotiating a massive corporate merger with Vanguard Holdings. I was trying to cash out and pass the toxic debt onto a larger corporation before his entire house of cards collapsed. I smiled, staring at the glowing data on my screen. Richard thought he was weeks away from securing a golden parachute that would cement his legacy as a titan of industry. He had no idea that Vanguard Holdings had just contracted Apex to handle the forensic due diligence for the merger. He had no idea that the lead auditor assigned to investigate his life's work was sitting on a private jet staring at his federal crimes. 2 days later, the biting cold of Aspen was replaced by the sweeping skyline of Chicago. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Apex Holdings, looking out over the concrete and glass canyons. The morning sun cast a sharp golden light across my mahogany desk, where my operations team had placed a thick stack of printed financial briefings. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of the skyscraper, a physical representation of the power we wielded. Down on the street level, people looked like tiny ants rushing to their jobs, unaware of the massive corporate transactions being executed right above them. Richard was currently down there somewhere, navigating morning traffic in his leased Bentley, pretending he was still a king. He had made it back to Chicago after his humiliating minivan road trip and budget airline flight. I knew this because Patricia posted a highly edited photo online complaining about commercial airlines trying to spin their forced demotion into a relatable joke about travel struggles. She omitted the part where her daughter grounded their private jet. I was not focused on their social media theatrics anymore. My attention was entirely consumed by the Vanguard Holdings acquisition file sitting on my desk. Vanguard was a monolithic investment conglomerate. They swallowed vulnerable supply chain networks, optimized routes, and spat out staggering profits. Richard had spent 2 years desperately courting them. His supply chain company was a dying dinosaur gasping for air in a modernized market. He had masked the company decay with aggressive expansion campaigns built entirely on borrowed money. If Vanguard acquired his firm, Richard would receive a massive cash payout and a seat on their advisory board. He would secure his billionaire status and successfully dump his toxic debt onto a larger entity before the federal government ever noticed the discrepancies. It was a brilliant exit strategy for a narcissist. There was only one problem with his flawless escape plan. Vanguard Holdings did not simply write checks based on blind faith. They were notorious for ruthless due diligence. When Vanguard wanted to buy a company, they hired outside forensic auditors to tear the target apart, examining every single receipt, wire transfer, and offshore account. They wanted to know exactly what they were buying before signing acquisition papers. And Vanguard Holdings trusted only one private equity firm to conduct their most sensitive corporate investigations. They trusted Apex Holdings. The official email from the Vanguard executive team had arrived in my inbox at exactly 8 in the morning. They formally requested Apex to deploy a lead auditor to oversee the risk assessment for Richard's supply chain company. The timing was almost poetic. Richard was handing over the keys to his entire financial survival directly to the very firm where I was a senior partner. I was willingly opening his vault and inviting the wolves inside, all while believing he was about to secure his legacy. I sat down at my desk and pulled the Vanguard contract toward me. As a senior partner, I had the authority to assign any auditor in my division. I could have handed it off to a junior executive. I could have let standard procedural audits flag the wire fraud and let the chips fall where they may. But that was not my style. This was personal. This required a surgical touch. I opened my encrypted network portal and initiated a standard protocol we frequently used for highly sensitive corporate espionage cases. I established a proxy limited liability company. In the high-stakes world of private equity, blind proxies were commonly used to prevent target companies from recognizing the names of the auditors, investigating them, thereby preventing them from attempting to bribe or manipulate specific individuals. I registered the proxy under a generic corporate title. I assigned myself as the lead forensic director, utilizing only my professional credentials and shielding my actual legal name behind the corporate veil. I generated the engagement letter and authorized the digital signature on behalf of Apex Holdings. I sent the confirmation back to the Vanguard Executive Board accepting the assignment. I would personally oversee every single document Richard submitted. I would be the one tracing Jamal's illegal wire transfers. I would be the unseen architect of their total destruction. Richard had absolutely no idea. Right now, he was likely sitting in his own office surrounded by expensive art and imported furniture, patting himself on the back for securing the Vanguard deal. He probably thought the due diligence process was just a minor administrative hurdle, a simple rubber stamp before the champagne was uncorked. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. I thought he could keep up his fraudulent double ledgers, continue funding Cassidy's absurd luxury lifestyle and escape with millions of dollars in clean corporate cash. He completely forgot that he had raised a daughter who understood the exact mechanics of financial ruin. He forgot that I was the one who had always noticed the small details, the quiet inconsistencies, the things everyone else glossed over. He told me I was useless and ordered me to walk home in a blizzard because I did not fit his image of success. He reduced my life to an inconvenience. Now I held the absolute power to reduce his life to a federal indictment. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead investigative team. I ordered them to begin mirroring Richard's corporate servers. I wanted every deleted email, every hidden expense report, and every encrypted message Jamal had ever sent. I wanted the complete financial anatomy of their fraud laid bare on my monitors before the end of the week. The war officially moved from the snowy tarmac to the glass boardrooms of Chicago. They thought they had simply left me behind in the cold. They were about to learn I had beaten them back to the city and was waiting for them at the finish line. My office phone rang, breaking the absolute silence of my workspace. It was not my personal cell phone that had been vibrating for days with angry texts from extended family. This was my secure corporate line. I glanced at the caller identification display. Richard was calling. He must have bypassed the main reception desk and used a direct extension he found in an old email signature from years ago, back when I worked at a lower-tier firm. I had no idea this number now routed directly into the executive suites of Apex Holdings. I reached out and pressed the flashing green button, engaging the corporate recording system. A small red light illuminated on the console, indicating that every syllable spoken on this line was being legally captured and archived on secure, federal-compliant servers. Standard protocol for a private equity partner. Devastating for a man about to confess to federal wire fraud. I picked up the receiver and answered with a simple greeting. Savannah, I am only going to say this once, so you better listen closely. Richard did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was dripping with that familiar, suffocating condescension. He spoke slowly and loudly, as if giving instructions to a particularly slow child. He was operating under the delusion that I was currently sitting in a tiny cubicle somewhere, trembling from the social media backlash Cassidy had orchestrated. I am listening, Richard, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I know you are hurting, Savannah. Your mother and I understand that you acted out at the airport because you are deeply insecure. Grounding that charter flight was a pathetic stunt. A desperate cry for attention from a woman who has failed to achieve anything meaningful in her own life. We had to endure a miserable commercial flight because of your little administrative glitch, but we are willing to move past it. An administrative glitch. He truly believed I had just found a loophole to cancel a flight, not that I owned the entire fleet. What do you want, Richard? I asked, leaning back in my leather chair. I am calling to offer you a lifeline, he said, his voice swelling with unearned magnanimity. You have seen the online backlash. The entire family knows what you did to your pregnant sister. You are entirely isolated. But I am a generous man, Savannah. I am about to close a multi-million-dollar merger next week with Vanguard Holdings. It is a monumental deal that will solidify my legacy as a titan in the logistics industry. Once the ink is dry, I will have unparalleled influence. I stayed silent, letting him inflate his own chest. Here is my offer, Richard continued. You will go on social media today and post a public apology to Cassidy. You will admit that you acted irrationally, and that you are seeking professional help for your jealousy issues. If you do that and clear your sister's name, I will personally secure you a junior desk at my firm after the merger. A real job, Savannah. You can stop playing pretend at whatever low-level accounting firm you are currently haunting and actually learn how real corporate finance works under Jamal's mentorship. The sheer absurdity of the offer was beautiful. The man whose company was bleeding cash, whose chief financial officer was stealing money to buy designer handbags, was offering me a junior desk at a bankrupt firm. He wanted me to grovel to Cassidy in exchange for a front-row seat on the Titanic. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was the sound of true, effortless amusement. "Are you laughing at me?" Richard demanded, his tone sharpening instantly. "No, Richard," I said, softening my voice, deliberately adopting the persona of an awestruck subordinate. "I am just surprised. Vanguard Holdings is a massive conglomerate. They are notorious for walking away from deals if they find even a single misaligned decimal point in a target company portfolio. I am just a low-level accountant, as you said, but even I know Vanguard destroys companies during their due diligence phase. How did you possibly get them to the closing table?" The bait was dangling right in front of him. A narcissist can never resist the opportunity to explain their own brilliance, especially to someone they consider inferior. Richard swallowed the hook immediately. "Because I know how to run a flawless operation, Savannah." He boasted, his tone shifting from angry to intensely proud. "Vanguard sent their initial proxy request last week, demanding complete financial transparency. Most executives would panic. They would hide behind their legal teams. But I do not hide. I provided them with absolute access. Complete access," I echoed, feeding his ego. "That sounds incredibly risky. Are you not worried their forensic teams will find something out of place?" "There is nothing out of place," he scoffed. "My books are pristine. Jamal and I spent the entire weekend personally compiling the unredacted corporate ledgers. We did not use automated software summaries. We generated the raw transactional data files ourselves to prove our financial dominance. Vanguard wanted transparency, and I gave them absolute clarity." My eyes flicked to the red recording light on my phone console. It was glowing brightly, capturing every single word. "That is impressive," I murmured, keeping my voice thick with fake admiration. "But surely you did not send raw, unredacted ledgers directly to Vanguard without layers of liability protection. If there is a single error in those files, the federal government could hold you directly responsible. A smart executive would have an underling sign-off on the data transfer to maintain plausible deniability." "I am not a coward," Savannah. Richard snapped, his pride overriding his basic survival instincts. "I do not hide behind underlings. I stand by my wealth. Jamal and I personally signed off on every single page of those unredacted ledgers. I authorized the digital transfer myself, using my private executive credentials. We submitted the flawless audited financials directly to the Vanguard proxy firm yesterday morning. My signature and Jamal's signature are on the master affidavit. We own our success." I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The trap had just slammed shut. Richard had just admitted on a legally recorded corporate line that he and Jamal had personally compiled and signed the fraudulent double ledgers. He had explicitly confirmed that no one else was responsible for the data transfer. He had eliminated his own plausible deniability. When the federal investigators inevitably asked who authorized the doctored financial reports, they would not have to look very far. Richard had just gift-wrapped his own federal indictment and handed it directly to the lead forensic auditor investigating him. "That is very good to know, Richard," I said, my voice dropping the fake admiration and returning to its natural, cold authority. "I am glad you and Jamal are taking full personal responsibility for the raw transactional data. It makes the administrative side of things much cleaner." "What are you talking about?" he asked, a brief flicker of confusion entering his voice. "Are you going to post the apology to your sister or not?" I leaned forward, resting my hand on the stack of Vanguard acquisition files sitting on my mahogany desk. "I am not going to apologize, Richard, and I will have to decline your generous offer for a junior desk. You see, I have my hands full right now analyzing a very fascinating set of raw corporate ledgers. It takes a lot of time to track offshore wire transfers. I will let you get back to planning your victory gala. Enjoy the illusion while it lasts." I pressed the flashing green button, disconnecting the call. The red recording light blinked twice and saved the audio file directly to the secure server. The evidence was fully secured. The criminal confessions were permanently locked into the system. The countdown to their absolute and total financial destruction had officially begun. I stepped out of my office and walked down the glass-walled corridor toward the primary forensic lab. My elite team of forensic analysts was already assembled. There were 5 of them, the absolute best in the industry. They specialized in tearing apart corporate financial structures and finding the hidden rot that executives desperately tried to bury. I took my place at the head of the conference table and pulled up the raw data files Richard had so arrogantly submitted to our proxy firm. Bring up the primary ledgers, I ordered. I want a cross-reference between their reported accounts receivable and the actual banking metadata from the past 36 months. Do not use their internal software summaries. Run everything through our proprietary extraction algorithms. The massive screens on the wall flickered to life. Rows of data began cascading down the monitors in rapid succession. For the first hour, we worked in absolute silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the cooling servers. We were hunting for anomalies that normal compliance checks would easily miss. My team knew exactly what to look for when inspecting fraudulent activity, but we were not conducting a standard audit. Wait a minute, my lead data architect, David said. He pointed at a specific cluster of offshore vendor payments. These routing numbers look strange. They are classified as international shipping tariffs, but they are bouncing through a clearinghouse in the Cayman Islands before hitting the actual freight providers. There is a processing delay of exactly 48 hours on every transaction. Isolate that clearinghouse, I instructed, my eyes narrowing at the screen. Trace the monetary flow during those 48 hours. Where is the capital sitting while it waits to be cleared? David ran the extraction protocol. The screens shifted, mapping out a complex web of digital wire transfers. A collective gasp echoed through the secure room as the true financial anatomy of Richard's supply chain company was finally laid bare. It was not just corporate mismanagement. We had just stumbled into a massive federal crime. Richard and Jamal were running a highly sophisticated double ledger system. They maintained one set of pristine books for the creditors, the board of directors, and the Vanguard executives. But hidden beneath the surface, buried in the metadata of those delayed international wire transfers, was a secondary shadow ledger. The shadow ledger was a financial graveyard. It revealed a staggering $15 million in toxic debt. Richard's core business had essentially been bankrupt for over 2 years. The supply chain company was hemorrhaging cash, unable to secure legitimate loans or pay basic operational costs. To keep the company afloat and maintain their facade of billionaire success, they had resorted to outright wire fraud. They were siphoning capital from ghost investors and newly acquired credit lines, routing the money through overseas shell companies to artificially inflate their domestic revenue reports. But the $15 million had not just vanished into operational losses. I directed the team to trace the outflow from the secondary shell companies back into the United States. We followed the digital breadcrumbs, and the destination accounts made my blood run cold. The stolen corporate funds were not being reinvested into the failing business. They were being funneled directly into personal trusts to finance Cassidy's ultra-luxury lifestyle. We watched the fraudulent wire transfers hit the screen one by one. There was a $2 million cash payment for a penthouse mortgage in downtown Chicago registered under a dummy corporation controlled by Jamal. There were monthly drafts of $50,000 paying off high-interest credit cards linked directly to Cassidy. We found the invoices for her imported sports cars, her exclusive country club memberships, and the absurd designer wardrobes she paraded around on social media. Jamal had literally embezzled millions of dollars from his father-in-law's failing company just to keep his spoiled wife convinced she was royalty. He had set up fake logistics consulting firms masking the theft as operational expenses. And Richard had let him do it because Richard was too proud to admit he had lost his wealth. Pull the authorization signatures for every single one of those offshore transfers, I commanded, leaning closer to the monitors. I want to know exactly whose digital fingerprints are on the trigger. David ran the final query. The system authenticated the transaction approvals. The results populated the main screen in bold red text. It was a flawless, absolute victory. Jamal's secure digital signature was stamped on every single illegal wire transfer. As the chief financial officer, he was the only one with the clearance to authorize payments of that magnitude. He had personally executed the embezzlement, leaving a blazing trail of digital evidence pointing directly to his office. But Richard was not innocent either. We found Richard's executive override codes appended to the shell company formations, proving he had full knowledge of the shadow ledger. My father had actively participated in building the very fraud that was currently funding his favorite daughter's fake reality. Package all of this, I said, standing up from the conference table. Every wire transfer, every hidden ledger, every forged signature. Encrypt the files and prepare a comprehensive presentation deck. Vanguard Holdings expects a full forensic report by the end of the week. We are going to give them exactly what they asked for. I walked out of the lab with a cold sense of satisfaction settling deep into my bones. The trap was fully loaded. The evidence was irrefutable. My family had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure who did not understand how the real world worked. They were about to learn that the real world was ruled by math, and math never lies. The $15 million hole in their accounting was a ticking time bomb, and I was the one holding the detonator. I smiled. I smiled. The drive back to my penthouse that evening felt like a victory lap. My residence occupied the entire top floor of a high-security building in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Access required a key fob, a biometric scan, and clearance from the front desk concierge. I stepped out of the private elevator and unlocked my front door, dropping my keys onto the entryway table. As I walked into the main living area, I froze. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa holding a cup of tea as if she owned the place was my mother. Patricia was wearing a beige cashmere wrap and her signature pearl necklace, looking around my sprawling apartment with a mixture of intense judgment and thin masked jealousy. "How did you get in here?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Patricia set her teacup down on a coaster. "Oh, do not be so dramatic, Savannah. I told the concierge I was your deeply concerned mother and that I was worried about your mental state after your little breakdown at the airport." I shed a few tears and he kindly escorted me up. "Really, you should speak to building management. The security here is dreadfully lenient for the amount of rent you must be paying. I own the entire floor, Patricia, and that concierge will be looking for a new job tomorrow morning." I kept my posture rigid, refusing to step further into the room. "What are you doing here?" Patricia sighed, folding her hands in her lap, assuming her favorite role as the weary peacekeeper. "I am here to clean up your mess. Your father is furious and Cassidy has been crying nonstop for 2 days. You have caused a massive disruption to this family, Savannah. I came to tell you exactly how you are going to fix it." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "I am fascinated to hear this plan. Please enlighten me." "First, you are going to pick up your phone and call the management of that aviation company," Patricia instructed, dictating her terms like I was a misbehaving teenager. "I do not care who you have to sleep with or beg at your little accounting firm to get their attention. You will tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding, and you will demand they reinstate your father's corporate account immediately. Then you are going to record a video for Cassidy's social media. You will look into the camera and apologize. You will say the altitude made you irrational and you deeply regret stranding a pregnant woman in the snow." "She is not pregnant," I replied flatly. "She was drinking champagne at the ski lodge and talking about getting a tummy tuck." "That is completely beside the point," Patricia snapped, her peaceful facade cracking. "It is about the public perception. Jamal's investors saw the entire ordeal. Do you have any idea the kind of stress you have put on your father? Richard has high blood pressure, Savannah. His doctor warned him about heart failure just last month. Your pathetic stunt at the airport and your refusal to fix this is literally killing your father. If he has a heart attack, it will be entirely your fault." There it was, the classic weaponized guilt. For decades, Patricia had used Richard's health, Cassidy's fragile emotions, and the general concept of family duty to force me into submission. She expected me to crumble, to apologize, to take the blame just to keep the peace. I walked slowly into the center of the living room, stopping just a few feet away from where she sat. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold contempt. "You want to talk about medical emergencies?" "Patricia," I asked, my voice lethal and quiet. "You want to talk about stress killing people? Let us rewind 10 years. Let us talk about my junior year of college." I collapsed in the library from a ruptured appendix. The campus hospital rushed me into emergency surgery. The doctors called you twice from the operating room because my heart rate was crashing due to a severe infection. Do you remember where you were when they called? Patricia looked away, suddenly very interested in the fabric of the sofa. That was a long time ago, Savannah. We were busy. You were at a luxury boutique in Manhattan, I stated, not letting her escape the memory. You and Cassidy were shopping for a dress for a sorority formal. You told the emergency room nurse to stop harassing you because you were in the middle of a fitting. You said, and I quote, "Savannah is always exaggerating for attention, just give her some aspirin." I woke up alone in a hospital bed with a tube in my arm. I paid my own medical bills by working night shifts at a diner. You did not even call me back until 3 days later to ask if I could design the invitations for Cassidy's party for free. I was trying to make sure your sister had a normal college experience. Patricia deflected, raising her chin defensively. You survived, did you not? You are standing here right now making a big deal out of ancient history. I am standing here because I learned how to survive without a mother, I replied. You do not get to come into my home and lecture me about Richard's blood pressure. You do not get to weaponize his stress after abandoning me when I was literally bleeding on an operating table. Richard is stressed because he is a narcissist who cannot handle losing control. And Cassidy is crying because she had to carry her own luggage for the first time in her pampered, useless life. Patricia stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. You are a cold, bitter woman, Savannah. You have allowed your career to turn you into a monster. Your father offered you a junior desk at his firm to save you from this miserable, lonely life, and this is how you repay us. You will call that aviation company right now, or you will never be welcome at our family table again. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Patricia, I do not need to call the aviation company. I already told you I am not fixing your mess. And as for your family table, you can keep it. I prefer eating meals with people who do not lie, cheat, and steal to maintain an illusion of wealth. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls. What are you implying? I am not implying anything, I said, walking over to the front door and pulling it wide open. I am stating a fact. You came here thinking you could manipulate me into submission because you still think I am the scared little girl desperate for your approval. I am not. I am the woman who owns this entire floor. I am the woman who sees right through your fake tears. And I am the woman telling you to get out of my house. Patricia stared at me, recognizing for the first time her usual tactics of guilt and shame bounced off me like bullets hitting bulletproof glass. She grabbed her designer handbag, her hands trembling with rage. You will regret this, Savannah, she hissed as she marched toward the door. When your father closes his merger with Vanguard next week, he will be more powerful than ever. He will make sure you are blacklisted from every accounting firm in this city. You will have nothing. I smiled warmly at her. Tell Richard I wish him the absolute best of luck with his Vanguard merger. Tell him to make sure his ledgers are perfectly organized. I hear Vanguard employs some very thorough forensic auditors. Patricia glared at me, not understanding the trap she and her husband were walking blindly into. She stepped out into the hallway and I slammed the heavy oak door, shutting her out of my life. I walked over to the security panel on the wall, revoked her access profile, and immediately drafted a termination notice for the concierge downstairs. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and looked out at the Chicago skyline. The enabler had played her last card and failed. Now it was time to let the real destruction begin. The morning after Patricia left my apartment, I walked into my office at Apex Holdings and found a thick, heavy envelope sitting dead center on my mahogany desk. The paper was premium cardstock sealed with a ridiculous gold wax stamp bearing my father's company logo. My assistant had placed it there, knowing I meticulously tracked all correspondence from Richard. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was an ostentatious gold-embossed invitation to the Vanguard merger gala at the grand ballroom of a premier Chicago hotel. Attached to the formal invitation was a handwritten note on Richard's personal stationery. I recognized his aggressive, jagged handwriting immediately. The note read, Savannah, I am offering you one final chance to be part of this family. Come to the gala. Sit in the front row. Witness what real corporate triumph looks like. Perhaps seeing my success will cure you of your bitter jealousy. Dress appropriately and try not to embarrass us. Richard. The sheer magnitude of his narcissism was almost poetic. He was throwing himself a massive, lavish victory party for a corporate merger that had not even legally closed yet. He was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on ice sculptures, premium catering, and live entertainment to celebrate a financial lifeline he desperately needed to avoid bankruptcy. And he wanted me sitting in the front row strictly to cement my status as the family failure. He wanted an audience for his coronation, and he needed his scapegoat daughter there to absorb his condescension. I did not throw the invitation away. I placed it gently on my desk, right next to the forensic audit file containing irrefutable proof of his federal wire fraud. I logged into the gala website using the custom access code he provided and checked the box to RSVP, yes. I even selected the premium steak option for my dinner. I wanted him to see my name on the guest list. I wanted him to feel completely invincible right up until the exact second I pulled the floor out from under him. As soon as my RSVP was confirmed, I engaged my secure corporate line and initiated a direct encrypted video call with the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings. His name was William, and he was a man who despised financial deception even more than I did. Vanguard did not become a monolithic corporate titan by allowing desperate supply chain executives to lie to them. The massive monitor on my wall flickered to life, revealing William sitting in his own corner office. He looked incredibly severe. I had sent him the preliminary forensic audit report at midnight. He had spent his entire morning reviewing the shadow ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the digital fingerprints Jamal left all over the embezzled funds. Savannah Williams said, his voice dropping like a gavel. "Tell me your elite team has locked down these raw data files. Tell me Richard and his fraudulent chief financial officer cannot scrub these servers before we strike." "The servers are mirrored and fully secured," William, I replied, maintaining absolute professional eye contact. "Every single illegal transaction is documented and cross-referenced." Jamal funneled $15 million in toxic debt through shell companies in the Cayman Islands to fund his wife's luxury lifestyle. Richard authorized the executive overrides himself. They handed us the murder weapon and signed the confession. William leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The anger in his eyes was cold and calculating. Vanguard Holdings does not take kindly to being used as a financial bailout for common thieves. We were prepared to inject massive capital into his infrastructure. He tried to saddle us with toxic waste. My legal team is already drafting the termination documents, but I want to make an example out of this arrogant fool. I want the entire market to know what happens when someone attempts to defraud Vanguard. I smiled, leaning forward. That is exactly why I am calling William. Richard is hosting a lavish merger gala this Saturday at a premier Chicago ballroom. He has invited the city elite financial reporters and all of his major creditors to celebrate the deal. He sent me a front-row ticket because he thinks I am just a low-level accountant. He expects me to sit there and applaud his genius. William caught on immediately. A dangerous smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He is throwing a victory parade for a war he has already lost. Precisely, I said. I propose we let him have his parade. Let him gather the press and his investors. Let him stand on that stage and boast about his flawless financials. And then, William, I propose we execute the termination clause live in front of his entire audience. I will personally deliver the forensic audit findings to his investors right there in the ballroom. William did not hesitate for a single second. It is brilliant, Savannah. It sends a lethal message to the market, and it protects our shareholders by publicly exposing the fraud before the opening bell on Monday. I will attend the gala personally. I will bring my executive board. But we need to ensure the authorities are positioned to act. A $15 million embezzlement requires immediate federal containment. I am already coordinating with federal law enforcement, I assured him. Because Richard and Jamal committed wire fraud across international lines, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service have jurisdiction. I will transmit the compiled evidence packet to the federal prosecutor this afternoon. They will be quietly waiting in the wings when the trap springs. No one gets to leave that room with stolen money. Excellent, William said. Savannah, you have saved Vanguard Holdings from a catastrophic liability. You have full authorization to execute this takedown. I will see you at the gala. The video feed cut out, leaving my office in quiet anticipation. I turned my chair to look out at the sprawling city skyline one more time. The trap was now fully armed and legally sanctioned by one of the most powerful corporate entities in the country. Richard had demanded my presence at his triumph. He was going to get exactly what he asked for. I spent the rest of the week methodically finalizing the digital presentation. I distilled thousands of lines of complex financial data into sharp, undeniable visual graphics. I created side-by-side comparisons showing the pristine fake ledgers next to the bleeding shadow accounts. I highlighted the offshore shell companies and isolated the exact dates Jamal transferred corporate funds to buy Cassidy a penthouse and luxury cars. I wanted the data to be so simple and devastating that even the waitstaff at the gala would understand exactly how my family had committed their crimes. I left zero room for interpretation. There would be no plausible deniability. There would be no gaslighting. There would only be cold, hard facts projected onto massive screens for all of Chicago high society to witness. On Friday evening, I left the office early to prepare my armor for the battlefield. I visited my personal tailor and picked up a custom-designed midnight blue evening gown. It was sleek, architectural, and commanding. It was not a dress meant for a supporting character sitting quietly in the audience. It was the uniform of an executioner ready to end an empire. My family had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority. They weaponized their fake wealth to make me feel worthless. They tried to break my spirit on a frozen tarmac and expected me to crawl back to them for scraps. Saturday night would not just be a corporate termination. It would be the complete dismantling of their entire reality. I hung the midnight blue gown in my closet and set my alarm. The endgame was finally here. The ballroom was a masterclass in unearned extravagance. Richard had spared no expense for his premature victory lap. Towering ice sculptures carved into his company logo flanked the double doors. Massive arrangements of imported white orchids cascaded from the ceilings. A live jazz quartet played softly, wrapping the room in a veneer of sophisticated wealth. Every single detail of this opulent display was funded by the toxic debt Jamal had hidden in their shadow ledgers. I slipped into the ballroom, avoiding the press line. The room was packed with the city elite, including major investors and several prominent corporate attorneys. I declined a drink and opted for a glass of sparkling water. I wanted my mind sharp for the execution I was about to perform. "Savannah, I cannot believe you actually showed up." I turned to see my sister Cassidy marching toward me, flanked by two superficial friends. Cassidy was wearing an outrageously loud crimson ball gown. But it was the jewelry that caught my attention. She was dripping in diamonds. A massive, brilliant cut diamond necklace rested against her collarbone, accompanied by matching drop earrings. My forensic team had tracked the wire transfer for those specific pieces just 3 days ago. Jamal had siphoned $200,000 from a corporate vendor account to a high-end jeweler in Geneva to buy them. She was literally wearing federal wire fraud around her neck. "You certainly have a lot of nerve showing your face here tonight," Cassidy sneered loudly. She looked me up and down, taking in my sleek, understated gown. Her lips curled into a condescending smirk. "Did you buy that off a clearance rack? I suppose it is the best a low-level accountant can manage. We want this night to look high class. My husband and father are closing the biggest deal in the city, and you are bringing down the aesthetic." Her friends giggled behind their champagne flutes. I did not react. I did not defend my custom-tailored gown or explain that it cost more than her entire fraudulent jewelry collection. I simply looked at the brilliant diamonds sparkling against her skin and offered a perfectly calm smile. "Enjoy the necklace, Cassidy." I said, my voice perfectly level. "It is a very striking piece. Make sure you get plenty of photographs wearing it tonight. You will want to remember how it feels." Cassidy scoffed, rolling her eyes and turning back to her friends. "She is so completely jealous," she muttered loudly as they walked away. "It is honestly pathetic." I stepped back into the shadows near the edge of the ballroom. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the entire catastrophic performance unfolding. Across the room, Jamal was holding court in a circle of prominent investors and Vanguard executives. I could hear his booming, arrogant voice cutting through the jazz music. "It is all about aggressive restructuring," Jamal boasted, taking a sip of his drink. "You have to know how to trim the fat and leverage the capital." When I took over the financial operations, I modernized our cash flow. We are running at peak efficiency. Vanguard recognized that immediately. They looked at my books and knew they were acquiring an absolute goldmine. The investors nodded, completely unaware that the man lecturing them about financial genius was actively embezzling millions to fund his wife's vanity. Jamal was intoxicated by the illusion of his own brilliance. A few yards away, Richard was standing under the bright lights of a local media crew. A financial reporter held a microphone toward him, asking about the legacy of his supply chain empire. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked directly into the camera lens. I built this company on a foundation of absolute integrity and relentless hard work, Richard declared, his chest puffed out with pride. This merger with Vanguard Holdings is the culmination of decades of disciplined leadership. It is a testament to the fact that honest American businesses can still achieve unparalleled dominance in the global market. Howe was proudly standing on national television, bragging about his deep integrity, while his shadow ledgers concealed exactly $15 million in stolen corporate funds. He was inviting the world to witness his brilliance, oblivious to the fact that he was broadcasting his own criminal confession. I felt a presence step quietly up beside me in the dim lighting of the ballroom periphery. It was William, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. He was holding a glass of sparkling water mirroring my own drink. He looked impeccably sharp in a charcoal suit carrying a dangerous edge. "Your father gives a compelling interview," William murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on Richard's media spectacle. If I had not spent the entire afternoon reading your forensic audit report, I might have actually believed him. It is a shame his accounting skills do not match his acting abilities. Narcissists always believe their own lies, William first replied, taking a slow sip of my water. Richard truly thinks he has outsmarted the entire financial sector. William took a sip of his water, his gaze shifting toward the grand entrance doors. I spoke with this federal prosecutor an hour ago. He noted, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur. The evidence packet your team submitted was flawless. The authorities are positioned in the lobby right now, holding the unsealed indictments. They are blending in with the hotel security staff, waiting for my signal. I looked around the glittering ballroom, absorbing the fake laughter, the clinking glasses, and the absolute arrogance radiating from my family. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. Now they were standing at the pinnacle of their manufactured high society, desperately clutching the stolen wealth they used to bludgeon me. The trap was fully set. The exits were covered. The audience was seated. "It is time," I said, turning to William. "Let us show them how the real world works." A sudden sharp chime of a crystal glass being tapped repeatedly echoed through the massive ballroom. The live jazz quartet brought their music to a smooth, professional halt. The low murmur of hundreds of high society guests faded into an expectant, hushed silence. The bright overhead spotlights shifted their focus entirely onto the center stage. Richard strode up the carpeted stairs with the practiced swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire city of Chicago. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo and gripped the outer edges of the clear lucite podium. He looked out over the sprawling sea of wealthy investors, media personnel, and corporate elites. He was visibly basking in the warm glow of his manufactured triumph. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen!" Richard projected, his voice booming heavily through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you for joining my family tonight. We stand on the precipice of a historic moment in the global logistics industry. When I started this supply chain company decades ago, I had absolutely nothing but a vision and an uncompromising work ethic. I built this empire, brick by brick, invoice by invoice, relying heavily on the traditional American values of deep integrity and unyielding financial discipline." I stood motionless in the shadows near the back of the room, watching him weave his elaborate web of lies. His ability to project absolute moral superiority while secretly sitting on a mountain of stolen money was almost terrifying to witness. He gestured grandly toward the front row. Cassidy and Jamal were sitting at the primary VIP table directly in the center of the spotlight. Cassidy adjusted her fraudulently purchased diamond necklace, making sure it caught the harsh glare of the media camera flashes. Jamal crossed his legs, looking smugly at the surrounding investors. "But a great man does not build a massive legacy entirely alone," Richard continued, his voice thickening with manufactured emotion. "He builds it for his family, and he builds it with his family." As I look toward the future of this great company, I know the torch must eventually be passed to the next generation of visionary leaders. I want to publicly recognize my chief financial officer and my brilliant son-in-law, Jamal. The audience erupted into polite high society applause. Jamal stood up briefly, giving a modest wave to the crowd before buttoning his designer suit jacket and sitting back down. Jamal has completely revolutionized our financial architecture, Richard declared, lying effortlessly to a room full of federal agents waiting quietly in the lobby. His aggressive restructuring and brilliant cash flow management have positioned us as an irresistible force in the modern market. And behind him, providing the unwavering support that only a dedicated family woman can give, is my beautiful daughter Cassidy. They represent the future of corporate excellence. They represent the absolute best of my legacy. Cassidy beamed, waving at the cameras like royalty. Patricia sat next to her, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. I felt a sudden wave of cold disgust wash over me. He was publicly crowning the very thieves who were sinking his ship. Richard signaled to a waiter who quickly brought him a tall crystal flute of premium champagne. He held the glass high above his head, the amber liquid catching the bright stage lights. "Tonight we do not just celebrate our past," Richard announced, his voice reaching a dramatic crescendo. "Tonight we celebrate our incredibly profitable future. We celebrate the imminent merger with Vanguard Holdings. This partnership will merge our flawless operational foundation with their global reach, creating an unstoppable titan of industry. I invite the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings, William, to join me on stage and raise a glass to our newly formed empire. Cheers to Vanguard. Cheers to family." The crowd cheered loudly, raising their expensive glasses in a unified toast. The applause was deafening, bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings. Richard stood at the podium, grinning from ear to ear, waiting for William to walk up the stairs and shake his hand for the flashing cameras. William stepped out from the shadows beside me. He did not grab a champagne flute from the passing waiters. He buttoned his dark charcoal suit jacket and walked down the center aisle with a predatory calmness that immediately altered the atmosphere in the room. The heavy applause began to falter and die out as people noticed his utterly serious expression. He did not look like a man arriving to celebrate a lucrative merger. He looked like a judge approaching the execution block. William climbed the stairs and walked directly to the podium. Richard held out his hand, expecting a firm public handshake to seal the illusion. William ignored the outstretched hand completely. He stepped right up to the microphone, gripping the stand with both hands. The remaining applause died out instantly, leaving a heavy, deeply uncomfortable silence hanging over the grand ballroom. Richard let his smile freeze. He slowly lowered his empty hand, stepping back slightly as William took total control of the stage. "Vanguard Holdings does not celebrate prematurely." William spoke directly into the microphone, his deep, resonant voice echoing sharply against the sudden quiet. "We are a company built on absolute financial reality. When we approach an acquisition of this enormous magnitude, we do not rely on pretty speeches about integrity or family legacy. We rely on hard, verifiable data. We rely on the brutal, unvarnished truth." A low, nervous murmur rippled through the audience of wealthy investors. The journalists at the back of the room lowered their cameras, sensing a sudden, massive shift in the corporate narrative. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat, his arrogant posture suddenly dissolving into rigid panic. "Our strict due diligence protocols require total, absolute transparency." William continued, his piercing gaze sweeping across the quiet room before locking directly onto Richard. "We demand flawless execution. When we initiated the final audit of this supply chain network, we required outside independent verification to ensure the ledgers we received actually matched the reality of the market. We hired the most ruthless and precise forensic accounting firm in the nation to conduct a comprehensive shadow audit." Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He looked down at Jamal, then back at William, forcing a highly nervous chuckle. "William, there is no need for this intense scrutiny. We provided you with the unredacted files ourselves. Our transparency is absolute." William ignored the pathetic interruption completely. He leaned closer to the microphone, gripping it tighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, the forensic audit is now complete. Instead of raising a glass tonight, Vanguard Holdings believes the investors, the media, and the market deserve to see the final financial assessment before a single contract is signed. I would like to introduce the lead forensic auditor from Apex Holdings to present the absolute truth of this proposed merger. William gestured toward the shadows at the back of the room where I was standing. The massive spotlights immediately swung away from the stage, cutting through the darkness and illuminating me perfectly. I stepped forward into the glaring bright light. The midnight blue fabric of my custom-tailored gown swept heavily against the floor as I walked slowly down the long center aisle. Every single head in the massive ballroom turned to look at me. The silence was so profoundly deep, you could hear the soft rhythmic click of my heels striking against the polished hardwood floorboards. As I approached the front row, I saw Cassidy's jaw drop completely open in sheer disbelief. Patricia gasped loudly, bringing a shaking manicured hand to cover her mouth. Jamal gripped the edge of his VIP table, his knuckles turning stark white as his eyes widened in sheer unfiltered terror. Richard gripped the lucite podium tightly, staring down at me, as if he were seeing a ghost walking right into the center of his perfect financial illusion. I did not look at any of them. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the stage, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. I climbed the carpeted stairs, stepping directly into the bright spotlight beside William. I walked straight to the podium and pulled the microphone toward me. "Good evening," I said into the microphone. My voice echoed across the massive, silent ballroom, cold and entirely devoid of emotion. As William mentioned, I am the lead forensic auditor for Apex Holdings. I am also the woman who spent the last week tearing apart the financial architecture of this supply chain empire. I turned my head slightly to look directly at Richard. He was standing completely paralyzed just a few feet away from me on the stage. All the manufactured color rapidly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat seized. He was a man watching a high-speed train collide with his glass castle, and he could not move a single muscle to stop it. Down in the front row, Cassidy let out a harsh scoff. She crossed her arms, rolling her eyes dramatically toward the ceiling. "Is this some kind of terrible joke?" she complained, her voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Someone get her off the stage. She is just a low-level accountant trying to ruin my husband's big night because she is hopelessly obsessed with me." Jamal did not turn to look at his wife. He did not tell her to be quiet or agree with her delusional assessment. He sat absolutely frozen in his VIP chair. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed entirely on the small digital presentation remote I held loosely in my right hand. He recognized the matte black clicker. He knew exactly what it connected to. He understood that his entire life of luxury and unearned prestige was about to end in spectacular fashion. I did not acknowledge Cassidy or her petty outburst. I simply raised the clicker and pressed the main button. Behind me, the massive theater projectors hummed loudly. The towering screens that had previously displayed Richard's pristine corporate logo instantly went black. A split second later, high-definition documents blazed across the displays, illuminating the entire stage in a harsh, bright white light. On the left side of the massive screens, I projected the flawless audited financial statements Richard had proudly submitted to Vanguard Holdings. On the right side of the screens, I projected the raw, unredacted banking metadata my team had extracted directly from their core servers. The stark difference between the two columns was massive, immediate, and financially lethal. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Experienced investors and corporate attorneys leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes darting rapidly between the two sets of numbers. They did not need an advanced degree in forensic accounting to understand what they were looking at. The staggering fraud was written in 50-foot-tall digital ink. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice projecting absolute authority over the murmuring crowd, "is a highly sophisticated double ledger system. For the past 36 months, this supply chain network has not been operating on the traditional American values of deep integrity as previously claimed. It has been operating on a foundation of federal wire fraud and systemic embezzlement." I pressed the clicker again. The screens zoomed in on a specific cluster of offshore transactions, highlighting them in bright, glaring red. "The ledger on your left shows robust domestic revenue, generated by aggressive operational expansion. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage, pointing toward the data. The ledger on your right, however, reveals the brutal reality. The operational expansion was a complete failure. To mask the catastrophic losses and maintain a facade of billionaire success, the executive leadership resorted to creating phantom invoices. They established a complex network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, registering them falsely as international logistics consulting firms. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the expensive camera shutters clicking rapidly from the press pool at the back of the room. Financial reporters were frantically typing on their phones, documenting every single devastating word. I continued the dismantling with clinical precision. They funneled newly acquired credit lines directly into these offshore shell companies. They deliberately delayed the processing of fake shipping tariffs for exactly 48 hours, creating a massive revolving pool of untraceable capital. Then they routed that capital back into their domestic accounts, artificially inflating their gross revenue reports. They lied to their creditors. They lied to their board of directors. And they attempted to lie to Vanguard Holdings in a desperate bid to secure a massive financial bailout before their entire house of cards collapsed under the crushing weight of $15 million in toxic debt. Richard gripped the lucite podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His breathing became erratic and shallow, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo. "Savannah, stop this right now," he hissed under his breath. His voice, a desperate, trembling whisper meant only for me to hear. "You are destroying the family. I will give you anything you want. Just turn the screens off immediately." I ignored his pathetic bargaining. I did not even look at him. I kept my gaze locked firmly on the audience, holding the entire room captive with the undeniable weight of the evidence. I wanted every single person in the room to understand the exact mechanics of his deception. I wanted the investors who had poured millions into his sinking ship to see exactly how their hard-earned capital had been so recklessly misused. "Vanguard Holdings demands flawless execution," I stated, echoing William's earlier sentiments. When my forensic team bypassed their standard accounting software and ripped into the raw transactional metadata, the truth was completely unavoidable. The supply chain empire you see before you is nothing but an empty shell. It is a dying company gasping for air, suffocating beneath a mountain of lies and flagrant financial manipulation. Every single profit margin reported over the last 3 years was a complete fabrication designed to lure a major buyer into absorbing their catastrophic losses. I pressed the clicker one more time. The screen shifted away from the broad corporate overview and focused entirely on the specific destination accounts where the stolen money had ultimately landed. The red highlighted numbers traced a devastating path directly from the Cayman Islands to local luxury retailers, high-end real estate holding firms, and exclusive country club memberships. Cassidy finally stopped scoffing. The sheer volume of the numbers on the screen and the shifting, dangerous atmosphere in the room slowly penetrated her thick bubble of entitlement. She looked at the bright screens and recognized the exact dates of the wire transfers. They perfectly matched the days she purchased her luxury imported vehicles and signed the massive mortgage for her downtown penthouse. Her mouth fell open as she turned to look at Jamal, but he could not even meet her gaze. I was staring at the floor, a broken, terrified man waiting for the inevitable drop of the guillotine. The illusion of Richard's wealth was completely shattered in an instant. I laid bare every single accounting trick, every hidden bank transfer, and every desperate attempt to maintain a fake billionaire lifestyle at the expense of his investors. The wealthy investors in the crowd began to whisper angrily to one another, pointing aggressively at the screens. The corporate attorneys were already reaching for their phones, pulling up the contact information for federal compliance officers and law enforcement contacts. The majestic Victory Gala had officially transformed into a massive public crime scene, and I was standing center stage holding the smoking gun for everyone to clearly see. I pressed the button on the presentation remote one final time. The massive projector screens behind me shifted from the complex web of shell companies to a very simple, undeniable list of direct wire transfers. The text was enlarged so that even the guests standing by the distant mahogany bar could read the exact dollar amounts. I turned away from the digital display and looked down into the center of the front row. I pointed my finger directly at my brother-in-law. Your chief financial officer did not just hide toxic corporate debt. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the ballroom. He actively siphoned $15 million of company capital directly into his own personal accounts to fund a luxury lifestyle that absolutely none of you could actually afford. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of enraged voices. Investors who had been politely sipping champagne just 20 minutes ago were now standing up and shouting demands for immediate explanations. The flashbulbs from the press pool fired in rapid succession, blindingly bright, as reporters scrambled to capture the exact moment the corporate facade completely disintegrated. Down in the VIP section, the crushing reality of federal prison finally broke Jamal. The slick, arrogant composure he had paraded around the room all night vanished in an instant. He leaped up from his chair, knocking his crystal water glass onto the carpeted floor. He scrambled frantically toward the stage, his designer shoes slipping slightly on the polished wood stairs. He lunged past Richard and grabbed the spare microphone resting on the secondary stand. "It was not my idea!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. The high-pitched screech of microphone feedback pierced the air, but he did not care. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard's chest. "He forced me to do it. He told me the company was going under, and we needed to maintain appearances for the Vanguard merger. He ordered the offshore transfers to keep the creditors off our backs. I was just following orders. I am not taking the fall for his massive failures." Richard spun around, his face turning an apocalyptic shade of purple. The polished billionaire persona completely evaporated, revealing the desperate, vicious narcissist hiding underneath. He lunged at Jamal, grabbing the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. "You greedy, incompetent thief!" Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted directly into his own microphone. "You were supposed to manage the ledgers. You were supposed to balance the debt. You skimmed millions off the top to buy that ridiculous penthouse and keep my spoiled daughter quiet. You ruined my company. You destroyed my entire legacy with your pathetic incompetence. You are the one going to federal prison, you absolute parasite." Jamal shoved Richard violently backward. Richard stumbled, catching his balance against the clear lucite podium. The heavy microphone stand tipped over and crashed onto the stage floor, broadcasting a deafening thud across the grand ballroom. "You approved every single transfer!" Jamal yelled back, his eyes wild with terror as he looked out at the angry crowd of investors. "You signed the executive override documents. You knew exactly where the money was going. You told me to buy Cassidy whatever she wanted, so she would stop complaining about the budget cuts. Do not try to pin your crumbling empire on me. You have been broke for years. You are a fraud, Richard. You are a complete fraud." Down in the front row, Cassidy let out a blood-curdling shriek. The reality that her diamonds, her cars, and her entire identity were funded by stolen money finally penetrated her thick skull. She scrambled up the stairs, tripping over the hem of her ridiculous crimson ball gown. She threw herself between her husband and her father, physically pushing Jamal away. "How could you do this to me?" Cassidy screamed at Jamal, hitting his chest with her fists. "You told me you earned those bonuses. You told me we were rich. You bought me that house and told me we were elite. You lied to me. You made me wear stolen jewelry in front of the entire city. My life is ruined because of you." Jamal caught her wrists, pushing her away roughly. "Oh, shut up, Cassidy," he snapped, all his previous affection for his pampered wife entirely gone. "You never cared where the money came from, as long as your credit cards kept clearing. You spent $50,000 on a handbag yesterday while our accounts were overdrawn. You are a delusional parasite, and I am not going to jail to protect your shopping habits." Patricia rushed onto the stage, desperately trying to pull her family apart. She grabbed Richard's arm, weeping hysterically, begging him to stop shouting in front of the media. She pleaded with Jamal to lower his voice, citing family loyalty and the importance of public discretion. But there was no discretion left to salvage. The perfect family was violently tearing each other apart on a brightly lit stage, broadcasting their deepest, darkest betrayals to the exact high society crowd they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. They screamed, they pushed, and they blamed each other for the catastrophic collapse of their fraudulent empire. They completely forgot about the investors. They forgot about the Vanguard executives. They even forgot about me. They were acting like cornered animals biting and clawing at each other in a desperate, pathetic bid for individual survival. I stepped back into the shadows beside William, perfectly content to let them destroy themselves. I watched them rip each other to shreds, with the very same cruelty they had directed at me my entire life. They had built a fragile glass castle on a foundation of lies and abuse. Now the walls were shattering, and the razor-sharp shards were cutting them all down to size. The explosion of their arrogance was absolute and total. The investors in the front row were physically backing away from the stage, repulsed by the chaotic display of raw greed. Corporate attorneys were frantically typing emails advising their clients to freeze all assets connected to Richard's supply chain network. The press pool cameras continued to flash rapidly, capturing every tear, every shove, and every screamed accusation. The footage would dominate the morning financial news networks, permanently destroying any chance Richard or Jamal had of securing future employment in the corporate sector. Patricia fell to her knees, weeping into her hands, surrounded by the deafening noise of her husband and son-in-law, threatening to destroy each other in federal court. Cassidy stood paralyzed, sobbing loudly as she stared at the massive projector screens above them, where the undeniable proof of her stolen lifestyle continued to glow brightly for all to see. I took a slow, calming breath. The air in the ballroom felt lighter, clearer, and infinitely more honest. The venomous family that had discarded me on a freezing tarmac, assuming I was too weak to fight back, had just publicly executed themselves. The $15 million receipt I had handed them was simply the match. Their own boundless arrogance was the gasoline that burned their empire to the ground. I stepped back completely into the shadow of the stage curtain, allowing the catastrophic family brawl to reach its absolute peak. Richard and Jamal were still screaming at each other, trading vicious accusations of corporate theft, while Patricia wept loudly on the floor. But the time for petty family arguments had officially expired. The corporate execution was over, and the federal reckoning was about to begin. William stepped forward, cutting through the chaos with the sheer force of his presence. He reached over the fallen microphone stand, picked up the heavy metal microphone, and tapped it once. The sharp, booming sound echoed like a gunshot through the ballroom, instantly silencing the screaming men on stage. Richard and Jamal froze, turning their wide, panicked eyes toward the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. They looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Vanguard Holdings operates under the strictest compliance of federal financial law. William announced, his deep voice projecting absolute unyielding authority over the silent crowd. When our due diligence uncovered a highly organized scheme involving $15 million in offshore wire fraud and blatant tax evasion, we were bound by fiduciary and legal duty. We do not negotiate with criminals. We do not sweep embezzlement under the rug to protect high society reputations. William paused, letting his gaze burn into Richard. Therefore, William continued, I must inform the investors and the press in this room that at 6 o'clock this morning, all findings from the Apex Holdings forensic audit were legally surrendered to the federal authorities. The appropriate agencies have reviewed the unredacted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital signatures authorizing the theft. The jurisdiction no longer belongs to corporate auditors. It belongs to the United States Department of Justice. Right on cue, the massive double mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung wide open. The heavy brass handles hit the walls with a resounding crack that made everyone in the room flinch. The federal agents did not run. They did not shout. They moved with the terrifying synchronized precision of professionals executing a highly coordinated raid. There were at least a dozen of them. Half were wearing sharp, dark suits with tactical earpieces, while the others wore dark windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters printed across the back, identifying them as the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The high society crowd, which had been buzzing with angry whispers just moments before, went completely dead silent. The sea of wealthy investors, prominent socialites, and corporate attorneys immediately parted down the middle. They scrambled backward, knocking over cocktail tables and crystal glasses, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the federal targets. In the world of high finance, proximity to an FBI raid was a deadly contagion. No one wanted to be caught in the splash zone of a federal indictment. Jamal saw the agents marching down the center aisle, and his entire body gave out. The arrogant chief financial officer who had confidently stolen millions to buy penthouse suites and designer handbags began to violently hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as sheer blinding panic seized his lungs. He stumbled backward away from the podium, tripping over the edge of the stage carpet. He collapsed onto his knees, scrambling backward like a cornered rat, until his back hit the rigid base of the projection screen. No, Jamal gasped, shaking his head wildly as the lead FBI agent stepped up onto the stage. No, please, you have to listen to me. I was just following orders. I can give you the account numbers. I can testify against Richard. Please do not do this. I have a family. The lead agent did not entertain the bargaining. He moved forward with absolute clinical efficiency. He grabbed Jamal by the shoulder, hauling him roughly to his feet. Jamal, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The agent stated, his voice loud and clear, ensuring the press cameras at the back of the room captured every single word. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Jamal's wrists cut through the silent ballroom. Jamal broke down completely, sobbing openly, as the reality of federal prison shattered his luxurious delusion. His knees buckled again, but two agents flanked him, holding him upright by his expensive tailored jacket. While Jamal was having a total psychological collapse, Richard went entirely catatonic. The billionaire facade, the ruthless patriarch who had ordered his own daughter to walk home in a freezing blizzard, simply ceased to exist. His eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the far wall of the ballroom. His jaw hung slightly slack and his arms remained frozen at his sides. He did not fight. He did not scream. He did not try to blame Jamal anymore. The sheer magnitude of his public destruction had short-circuited his narcissistic brain. An agent from the Internal Revenue Service stepped directly in front of him, blocking his blank stare. Richard, you are being placed under federal arrest for tax evasion, corporate fraud, and international money laundering, the IRS agent announced, pulling a pair of steel cuffs from his belt. Put your hands behind your back. Richard did not move. He was a hollow shell of a man. The agent firmly grabbed his arms, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The second set of handcuffs clicked shut, locking the great titan of industry in federal restraints. Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing wail from the floor of the stage. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, grabbing at the pant leg of the IRS agent. You cannot take my husband. Patricia screamed, her carefully styled hair now a chaotic mess around her tear-stained face. We are good people. We are wealthy people. You are making a mistake. You have to arrest Savannah. She is the one who set us up. She manipulated the data. The agent looked down at Patricia with an expression of pure professional disgust. Release my uniform right now, or you will be charged with interfering with a federal investigation. Patricia recoiled as if she had been physically burned. She pulled her hands back, covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably into the carpet. The ultimate enabler was finally powerless. Her tears, her weaponized guilt, and her manipulation tactics held absolutely zero currency with federal law enforcement. Cassidy remained frozen in the front row, watching her husband and her father being marched down the stairs of the stage in handcuffs. She looked down at the massive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, her breathing shallow and ragged. The illusion of her elite status had just been ripped away, leaving her exposed as nothing more than the beneficiary of a massive criminal conspiracy. The agents flanked Richard and Jamal, turning them toward the center aisle to begin the longest walk of their lives. The camera flashes erupted into a blinding strobe light effect, illuminating their humiliated faces. Every major investor, every rival, CEO, and every high society friend they had ever tried to impress stood in absolute silence, watching them being escorted out like common criminals. I stood quietly next to William, observing the execution of justice, with a steady, unblinking gaze. Richard was walked right past me. His blank eyes briefly flickered, focusing on my face for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, I saw the total, devastating realization register in his mind. He finally understood that the daughter he had treated like worthless garbage was the architect of his absolute ruin. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply maintained my calm, authoritative posture, letting him carry the image of my unbroken strength with him into the back of a federal squad car. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom slammed shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars parked outside. The suffocating silence returned to the grand ballroom. The investors and corporate elites remained frozen in their places, processing the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe they had just witnessed. William offered me a brief, respectful nod before turning to coordinate with his executive team. He had a massive corporate cleanup to initiate, and Vanguard Holdings needed to distance itself from the wreckage immediately. I remained standing on the edge of the stage, looking down at the scattered remnants of my family. Patricia was still sobbing softly into the carpet. Her designer gown ruined her perfect facade, completely shattered. But it was Cassidy who broke the quiet. A primal, piercing scream tore from her throat. She scrambled up from the front row, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. The heavy crimson fabric of her ball gown caught on the stairs, but she ripped it free, tearing the expensive silk as she charged directly toward me. "You manipulative, jealous psycho!" Cassidy shrieked, her voice cracking as she threw herself across the stage. She raised her hands, curling her fingers into claws, desperately trying to physically attack me. Two large event security guards immediately lunged forward, intercepting her before she could cross the final few feet. They grabbed her arms, restraining her as she thrashed and kicked wildly in her expensive heels. "Let me go," she roared, fighting against the guards. "You ruined my life, Savannah. You destroyed my husband. You did this because you have always been obsessed with me. You could never stand the fact that I was the favorite, that I was beautiful and married and rich, while you were just a pathetic, lonely accountant." I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I stood perfectly still, watching her thrash against the security guards like a toddler having a monumental temper tantrum. The entire room of high society guests watched in absolute horror as the golden child completely lost her mind on stage. "You set them up!" Cassidy wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "You fabricated those numbers because you wanted to steal my life. You are a monster." I waited for her to run out of breath. When her screaming finally subsided into heavy, ragged gasps, I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I looked down at the massive, brilliant cut diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The diamonds sparkled under the harsh stage lights, a glaring symbol of the federal wire fraud her husband had committed. "I am not a monster, Cassidy," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet tone that carried easily through the silent ballroom. "And I did not fabricate a single digit on those screens. Your husband and your father dug their own graves. I simply handed the shovels to the federal government." "You are lying," she sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "Jamal is a brilliant financial officer. We earned our money. We built a beautiful life, and you took it away out of pure spite." I tilted my head, studying her pathetic delusion. "You really do not understand how any of this works, do you, Cassidy? You spent your entire life swiping credit cards without ever wondering whose bank account was actually draining to pay the bill. You thought you were elite. You thought you were untouchable. But your entire existence was subsidized by a criminal enterprise." I raised my hand and pointed directly at her chest. "That custom diamond necklace you are wearing right now was purchased with $200,000 of stolen corporate capital. The matching earrings cost another $50,000. The customized imported sports car you drove to this gala was bought using a fraudulent shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. And that massive penthouse you love to flaunt on social media is currently holding a $2 million mortgage secured by highly illegal offshore wire transfers. Every single luxury you have ever enjoyed was stolen directly from the investors standing in this very room." Cassidy stopped fighting against the guards. Her eyes went wide as the crushing weight of reality finally pierced her thick bubble of entitlement. She looked down at her necklace, her trembling hands hovering over the diamonds. "The federal agents did not just arrest your husband and your father tonight." I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of her fake reality. "They also executed emergency asset freeze orders on every single bank account associated with the supply chain network. The Department of Justice does not allow criminals to keep the spoils of their fraud." "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine terror. "It means everything is gone, Cassidy," I stated with absolute clinical precision. The federal government is going to seize the penthouse. They are going to impound the sports cars. They are going to freeze your personal checking accounts, and they are going to confiscate every single piece of jewelry you are currently wearing because it was all purchased with stolen money. You do not own a single thing. It was all a mirage manufactured by thieves. Cassidy stared at me, her face completely devoid of color. Her knees buckled and the security guards had to support her entire weight to keep her from collapsing onto the stage floor next to Patricia. "You cannot do this to me," she begged, her voice shrinking into a pathetic whimper. "I am a victim here. Jamal lied to me. I did not know where the money came from." I leaned in close, ensuring she heard every single syllable of my final verdict. "You are not a victim, Cassidy. You are just broke." The words hung in the air, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. It was over. The next morning brought a financial bloodbath of historic proportions. Inside my corner office at Apex Holdings, I stood holding a cup of black coffee, watching a wall of flat-screen monitors broadcast the absolute destruction of my father. Every major financial news network was running continuous loop footage of Richard and Jamal being escorted out of the grand ballroom in federal handcuffs. The bright flashing tickers at the bottom of the screens told the real story. Vanguard Holdings had filed an emergency declaration with the Securities and Exchange Commission at dawn, officially and permanently withdrawing from the proposed merger. The statement Vanguard released to the press was completely ruthless, citing uncovering massive systemic fraud and illegal offshore accounting practices during the final hours of due diligence. The market reaction was instantaneous and entirely lethal. As soon as the opening bell rang on the trading floor, Richard's corporate stock went into a terrifying freefall. It did not just dip. It plummeted, falling 80% in the first 10 minutes of trading before the exchange triggered an automatic volatility halt. When trading resumed, the sell-off was a stampede. Institutional investors dumped millions of shares at once. By 9 in the morning, a company that Richard had proudly claimed was worth hundreds of millions of dollars was trading for literal pennies a share. The illusion was dead and the financial reality was a smoking crater. The fallout rippled violently across the city. Creditors began circling the bleeding carcass of the supply chain network like starved vultures. Major banks immediately froze the company's operating accounts and called in their massive commercial loans. Federal agents swarmed Richard's downtown headquarters, seizing hard drives, locking down the executive suites, and hauling out boxes of physical records. The blue-collar workers, the warehouse staff, the truck drivers, and the mid-level logistics managers arrived for their morning shifts, only to find yellow crime scene tape across the loading docks and locked gates. Thousands of innocent people were suddenly staring at the terrifying prospect of unemployment because of the boundless greed of two arrogant men. I turned away from the television monitors and walked back to my mahogany desk. My lead data architect, David, was already waiting for me alongside the rest of my elite forensic team. They had not slept. We had spent the entire night dissecting the absolute bottom of Richard's ruined ledgers. We had successfully isolated the toxic debt and the fraudulent Cayman Island shell companies away from the actual physical infrastructure of the business. Underneath the $15 million of embezzled funds and the fake revenue reports, there was an actual functioning supply chain. Richard owned physical warehouses, prime distribution routes, and a fleet of heavy transport vehicles. The core logistics network was highly valuable. It was just suffocating under the weight of executive theft. "We execute the acquisition protocol right now," I instructed my team, pulling up the targeted asset list on my primary monitor. "We are not buying his corporate entity. That shell is dead and buried in federal investigations. We are operating through a subsidiary arm of Apex Holdings to purchase the viable liquidated physical assets directly from the emergency bankruptcy trustee." David nodded rapidly, typing on his tablet. "The creditors are in an absolute panic, Savannah. They are staring at a total loss. They will take pennies on the dollar just to salvage something from the wreckage before the federal government seizes the rest of the capital for tax evasion penalties." "Exactly," I said, my voice sharp and decisive. "We isolate the warehouses, the fleet vehicles, and the active vendor contracts. We strip away the toxic debt and leave Richard's personal liabilities to rot. Draft the offer at 12 cents on the dollar. It is a brutal undercut, but they have zero leverage and no other buyers willing to touch this radioactive disaster. 2 hours later, I walked into the sterile gray conference room of a federal bankruptcy court building. The emergency trustee assigned to manage the sudden implosion of Richard's empire sat at the head of a long table, looking entirely overwhelmed. A dozen frantic corporate attorneys representing the major creditors were shouting over each other, desperately trying to figure out how to recoup their massive losses. The room smelled of stale coffee and sheer panic. I took a seat at the far end of the table, placing a single crisp manila folder down in front of me. The loud, arguing attorneys paused, turning to look at the unexpected arrival. "I represent Apex Holdings," I announced, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room with calm, absolute authority. "I am here to offer a solution to your catastrophic problem." I pushed the folder down the long table toward the bankruptcy trustee. He opened it, scanning the numbers with wide, exhausted eyes. "I am offering a direct cash buyout of all physical supply chain assets, transportation fleets and domestic distribution centers," I stated, laying out the terms with clinical precision. "We are offering 12 cents on the dollar for the physical infrastructure. We are assuming zero of the corporate debt. We are completely isolating ourselves from the criminal liabilities of the former executive board." An attorney representing one of the largest banks slammed his hand on the table. 12 cents on the dollar is an absolute insult. It is corporate robbery. You are trying to steal this infrastructure while the body is still warm. I looked directly at the angry attorney, not flinching a single millimeter. "You are entirely correct. The body is warm. But by tomorrow morning, it will be completely frozen by the Department of Justice. When the federal prosecutors secure the final indictments for wire fraud and embezzlement, every single account tied to that corporate entity will be seized for restitution. You will be tied up in federal litigation for a decade fighting over scraps. I am offering you an immediate clean cash exit today. Take the lifeline or go down with the ship." The attorneys fell completely silent. They knew I was holding the absolute winning hand. They had zero counter-arguments because math simply does not care about their outrage. "But there is one non-negotiable condition to my offer," I added, leaning forward slightly. "Apex Holdings requires the immediate reinstatement of the entire blue-collar workforce. The warehouse staff, the truck drivers, and the regional logistics managers are completely innocent in this fraud. We are acquiring this infrastructure to run it efficiently. Those employees will retain their jobs, their seniority, and their benefits under our new management structure. We are cutting out the executive rot, not the working-class backbone." The bankruptcy trustee let out a heavy sigh of relief. Guaranteeing the preservation of thousands of jobs made the brutal financial undercut completely palatable to the court. It was a flawless victory for public relations and a lethal strike in the corporate sector. The trustee picked up his pen and signed the preliminary acquisition agreement without another word of protest. I stood up from the conference table, buttoning my tailored blazer. I had just purchased the absolute crown jewel of my father's entire life. I had taken the empire he used to belittle me and bought it for absolute pocket change. I secured the jobs of the innocent workers he had recklessly endangered, and I expanded my own private equity portfolio by millions. Richard had always told me I lacked the vision to understand real business. Now I literally owned his. 1 month passed since that day in the bankruptcy court. The absolute destruction of my family was not just a rapid explosion. It was a slow, agonizing descent into a reality they were entirely unequipped to handle. The federal justice system moved with a terrifying, relentless efficiency. Jamal was formally indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. I was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial because the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk and denied bail. Without the stolen corporate funds to pay for high-priced defense attorneys, he was relying on an overworked public defender who was already advising him to take a severe plea deal. Cassidy experienced the most brutal awakening of them all. The Department of Justice executed their asset forfeiture warrants with zero mercy. The federal agents seized her downtown penthouse, changing the locks and posting bright orange seizure notices on the doors. They impounded her imported sports cars right out of the parking garage. The luxury retail accounts were frozen, and her fraudulent diamond jewelry was confiscated as evidence of international money laundering. She was stripped of every single material possession she had ever bragged about on social media. With zero personal income and absolutely no marketable job skills, she was unceremoniously evicted and dumped onto the street. Patricia faced a similar eviction. Richard's massive suburban estate was foreclosed on by the banks and seized by federal authorities to cover the massive tax penalties he had incurred. Richard himself was incarcerated awaiting his own federal trial, completely isolated from the high society friends who had immediately abandoned him the second the handcuffs clicked shut. Stripped of their wealth and their social standing, Patricia and Cassidy had no other choice. They were forced to move into a cheap, dilapidated roadside motel on the outskirts of the city, living out of plastic garbage bags and cheap suitcases. The golden child and the ultimate enabler were finally experiencing the exact financial terror they had mocked me for enduring during my college years. I did not reach out to them. I did not offer a single cent of assistance. I spent the month successfully integrating the liquidated physical assets of Richard's ruined empire into the Apex Holdings portfolio. I stabilized the supply chain network, secured the jobs of the warehouse workers, and generated an immediate 20% profit margin in the first 30 days of operations. I was operating at the absolute peak of my career, completely unburdened by the toxic anchor of my family. But narcissists never truly accept defeat until they have exhausted every single manipulative tactic in their playbook. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my secure office phone buzzed with an urgent call from the lobby's security desk. The chief security officer sounded incredibly tense. He informed me that two women claiming to be my mother and sister had managed to bypass the ground floor security checkpoint by loudly weeping and creating a massive public scene in front of our most important corporate clients. To avoid a further disruption in the main lobby, a junior security guard had escorted them up to my executive floor, hoping I could quietly defuse the situation before the police were called. I instructed the security officer to send 2 armed guards to my floor immediately. I stood up from my mahogany desk, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. I walked across my spacious office and pulled open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the polished marble hallway. Patricia and Cassidy were standing near the executive reception desk. The sight of them was genuinely jarring. The polished, pristine facade they had spent their entire lives cultivating was completely gone. Patricia was wearing a wrinkled trench coat, her hair unwashed and pulled back into a messy knot. The expensive pearl necklace she used to flaunt was missing, likely sold to pay for their cheap motel room. Cassidy looked even worse. She was wearing cheap sweatpants and a faded hooded sweatshirt, her eyes swollen and red from weeks of crying. The arrogance that usually radiated from her posture had evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, terrified shell of a woman. When Patricia saw me stepping out of my office, her eyes lit up with a desperate, manic hope. She immediately launched into her performance, completely ignoring the cold professional atmosphere of the corporate firm. "Savannah!" Patricia cried out, her voice echoing shrilly down the marble hallway. She rushed forward, throwing her hands up in a theatrical display of maternal agony. "Thank goodness you are here. You have to help us. We have absolutely nothing left, Savannah. We are living in a filthy motel room with a broken heater. We barely have enough money to buy groceries for the week." I stood perfectly still, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not offer her a welcoming smile. I did not invite them into my private office. I let them stand in the public hallway directly under the harsh fluorescent lights where my colleagues could clearly see them. "You bypassed my building security to complain about your living conditions," I asked, my voice freezing the air between us. "You are trespassing in a private corporate facility, Patricia." "How can you be so cold?" Patricia wailed, clutching the fabric of her wrinkled coat. "We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot just abandon us to live on the streets. You have millions of dollars, Savannah. You bought your father's entire company for yourself. You have to bail us out. You owe us that much for family loyalty." Family loyalty, I repeated, testing the phrase on my tongue as if it were a foreign language. That is a fascinating concept. Tell me, Patricia, where was this profound sense of family loyalty when you left me bleeding in an emergency room to go dress shopping? Where was this loyalty when you watched Richard kick me off a flight in the middle of a blizzard? You did not care about family loyalty when you were spending stolen money to buy Cassidy diamonds. You only care about family loyalty now because you are completely out of cash. Cassidy stepped forward, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her faded sweatshirt. Please, Savannah, she begged, her voice trembling with absolute desperation. Jamal is locked in a federal cell. The lawyers will not even answer my calls anymore. I have nowhere to go. I do not know how to live like this. I cannot survive in that disgusting motel. You have to give us an apartment. You have plenty of real estate. Just give us a safe place to stay. I looked at my younger sister, the golden child, who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She was practically on her knees begging for the very same scraps she used to laugh at me for scraping together. You are asking me to fund the lifestyle your criminal husband could no longer steal for you, I stated, measuring every word for maximum impact. You want me to subsidize your existence because you never bothered to learn how to work a single day in your life. We are begging you, Patricia interrupted, stepping closer, trying to grab my hand. I pulled my arm back sharply, refusing the physical contact. We made mistakes, Savannah. We know we were wrong. But you are the only one left who can save us. Please be the bigger person. Do not let your mother and sister starve in a miserable motel. I stared at the two women standing before me. They were not apologizing for their abuse. They were not showing genuine remorse for the years of psychological torture they inflicted upon me. They were simply crying because they were experiencing the consequences of their own spectacular greed. They expected me to rescue them because they fundamentally believed my sole purpose in life was to serve their needs. They thought my wealth was an open bank account they could manipulate their way into accessing. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I let the silence stretch down the long, polished marble hallway. The heavy security doors at the end of the corridor stood firmly guarded by two armed men waiting for my signal. Patricia stood perfectly still, expecting the familiar capitulation she had conditioned into me for decades. She fully expected the maternal guilt to finally take hold and break my resolve, just as it always had when I was a vulnerable child. Instead, I looked at her with an unwavering glacial calm, pulling the last remaining shreds of hope directly from her chest. You think this is about me refusing to be the bigger person, I said, making sure every single syllable landed with the crushing weight of an anvil. You think you are standing in this hallway wearing dirty clothes because I executed a malicious audit to punish you out of sheer petty jealousy. You are completely and entirely wrong. Patricia flinched, but kept her hands clasped tightly together. Savannah, please do not do this. I stepped closer, forcing her to look me dead in the eye. I did not ruin you, Patricia. I did not force Jamal to steal $15 million from corporate accounts to buy Cassidy imported sports cars and penthouse suites. I did not force Richard to falsify federal corporate ledgers to trick Vanguard Holdings into a massive financial bailout. You ruined yourselves. Your absolute boundless greed destroyed your fake empire. Your own breathtaking arrogance put your husband and your son-in-law in federal holding cells. All I did was hand the United States Department of Justice the exact paperwork Richard proudly signed his own name to. Patricia shook her head frantically, refusing to accept the gravity of her own actions. The gaslighting was so deeply ingrained in her psychology that she immediately tried to deflect the blame back onto me. But we are family, she stammered, clinging desperately to the only weapon she had left. You could have warned us, Savannah. You knew exactly what Vanguard was planning. If you knew we were walking into a federal trap, you should have told your father. You let him walk right onto that stage and humiliate himself in front of the entire city. You let them put him in handcuffs. I want you to think very carefully about Aspen, Patricia, I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet pitch that made her visibly shudder. I want you to think about that freezing tarmac. I paid for that entire ski trip. I protected Richard's delinquent aviation account so you could all fly on a private jet. And when Richard blocked the boarding stairs and told me to walk back to Chicago in a blizzard, you stood right next to him. You looked down at me, shivering in the snow, and you told me to stop being selfish. You told me my safety was less important than a toy poodle getting its own leather seat. Cassidy shifted her weight uncomfortably, her bloodshot eyes darting toward the floor. If you had treated me like a human being for just 5 minutes on that runway, everything would be different. I continued, driving the bitter truth directly into their minds. If you had just let me on the plane, I would have sat across from Richard in the cabin. I would have looked at the Vanguard merger documents he was bragging about, and I would have told him that I was the lead forensic auditor assigned to his case. I would have warned him to delay the merger. I would have given him the crucial time he needed to hire defense attorneys and quietly restructure his toxic debt before the federal agents ever got involved. Your own monumental hubris sealed your fate. You locked the one person who could have saved your entire family out in the snow. Cassidy let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her eyes widened as the devastating reality of my words finally broke through her lifelong delusion. She realized in that exact moment that her designer bags, her mansion, her expensive cars, and her entire elite identity were lost simply because she refused to share a jet cabin with her older sister. The profound, staggering weight of that realization crushed whatever remaining fight she had left in her body. She did not scream. She did not throw a temper tantrum. She just stood there staring at the polished marble floor, completely and irreparably broken. Her shoulders slumped heavily, and the last spark of her golden child arrogance died right in front of me. Patricia, however, remained entirely incapable of self-reflection. She reached out, grabbing the sleeve of my tailored suit jacket. You cannot punish us forever for one mistake at an airport. We are destitute, Savannah. We have literally nothing left to our names. We are going back to a freezing motel room tonight, while you go home to a luxury penthouse. How can you sleep at night knowing your own mother is freezing in a slum? I sleep perfectly well, Patricia, I said smoothly, prying her desperate fingers off my jacket. Because the mother you are describing does not exist. You were never a mother to me. You were a warden. You were an enabler who watched your husband emotionally abuse me for 34 years and cheered him on every single time. You used my achievements when it suited your social image and discarded me the second I became inconvenient. You are not experiencing punishment right now. You are experiencing the natural, unyielding consequences of your own lifetime of cruelty. Patricia stared at me, her mouth trembling as the final absolute reality washed over her. She finally understood that the daughter she had spent decades breaking down had rebuilt herself into a fortress of impenetrable steel. There were no cracks left for her to exploit. There was no guilt left to weaponize. The dynamic had permanently shifted, and she was left entirely powerless, standing in the shadow of my corporate empire. I turned my gaze back to Cassidy, who was silently weeping into her hands. The golden child had fallen from her pedestal and shattered into a million pieces. The illusion of their superiority was entirely dismantled, leaving nothing but two desperate women facing a future devoid of the unearned wealth they had weaponized against me for my entire life. The silence in the corridor stretched out, feeling heavier than concrete. Patricia looked at Cassidy, then back at me. The final realization that her psychological manipulation held zero power over me finally snapped the last thread of her pride. The woman who had spent 60 years cultivating an image of impenetrable high society superiority completely folded in on herself. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor of my corporate hallway. "Savannah, I am begging you," Patricia pleaded, her voice reduced to a pathetic high-pitched whine. "Forget about the luxury. Forget about the penthouse and the cars and the status. We just need a roof over our heads. The motel is freezing and dangerous. We have no food. We have no way to pay for heating. Just give us enough money to rent a small apartment. A tiny studio anywhere in the city. You make millions of dollars every single month. A few $1,000s is nothing to you. It is pocket change. Please do not let your mother sleep on the streets." Cassidy remained standing, but she was openly weeping now, her face buried in her hands. The golden child was entirely mute, relying on the enabler to secure their survival. I looked down at Patricia kneeling on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a sudden surge of daughterly obligation. I only felt the profound clarity of a woman who had completely excised a malignant tumor from her life. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored midnight blue blazer. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of urgency. Patricia looked up, her tear-stained face suddenly illuminating with a pathetic, desperate flash of hope. She thought the begging had worked. She thought she had finally found the bottom of my empathy and managed to pry open my wallet. She watched with wide, hungry eyes as I pulled out a crisp, rectangular slip of paper. It was a certified bank check. I had printed it that very morning, anticipating this exact inevitable encounter. I held the check between my index and middle fingers, extending my hand slightly downward. Patricia practically scrambled upward, pushing herself off the marble floor with trembling arms. She reached out and snatched the check from my hand, gripping the paper like it was a life preserver in a stormy ocean. She quickly wiped her eyes, bringing the check close to her face to read the printed numbers. She was likely expecting to see $50,000, or maybe $100,000. She was expecting a payout that would allow her to immediately upgrade from the motel and maintain at least a sliver of her former dignity. Instead, Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking entirely ghost, like under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor. Her hands began to shake violently, rattling the crisp paper. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound confusion and absolute devastation. $500. Patricia whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the realization. Savannah, this is a check for exactly $500. This will not even cover a deposit on a slum apartment. This is absolutely nothing. What is this supposed to mean? I looked her dead in the eye, holding her gaze with the unyielding force of an absolute victor. That is the exact cost of a standard commercial flight from Aspen to Chicago, I stated, my voice echoing coldly down the long hallway. When Richard canceled my ticket on the private jet and told me to walk home in a blizzard, you stood on those boarding stairs and told me to stop being selfish. You stripped me of my transportation, my dignity, and my place in the family. You expected me to cover my own expenses while you flew away in stolen luxury. Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Cassidy finally looked up from her hands, staring at the check with hollow, defeated eyes. I am officially refunding your ticket, I announced, ensuring every syllable struck them like a physical blow. Your debt to me is paid in full and my obligation to you is permanently terminated. You have exactly $500 to your name. Now walk home. I did not wait for Patricia to respond. I did not wait for Cassidy to start screaming or begging again. I turned my back on them completely and entirely. I walked toward the heavy, solid oak door of my corner office. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a steady, powerful beat signaling the absolute end of their reign. I stepped across the threshold of my office, entering my sanctuary. The room was flooded with natural sunlight pouring in through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. I had built this empire from the ground up. I had survived their abuse, their manipulation, and their relentless cruelty. I had weaponized my own pain and transformed it into an impenetrable fortress of wealth, power, and total independence. I grabbed the polished brass handle of the heavy oak door. I looked back out into the hallway one last time. Patricia was still clutching the $500 check, standing paralyzed next to her broken golden child daughter. The two armed security guards stepped forward, moving to escort the trespassers out of my building and back into the cold, unforgiving reality they had created for themselves. I pulled the door shut. The heavy wood closed with a deep, resonant thud, silencing their pathetic existence forever. I reached up and turned the solid brass deadbolt. The lock clicked loudly, sealing my office and cementing my absolute, unshakable freedom. The war was over. I had won.